When Hanyo regained consciousness, everything around him dazzled so brightly he thought he might be in heaven. But a splitting headache lingered at the back of his skull. Surely there were no headaches in heaven. The first thing that came into view was a large frosted glass window. The window was featureless, and it overflowed with whiteness. "Looks like he's come round," someone said. "Thank goodness for that. Saving someone's life always puts a spring in your step for the rest of the day." Hanyo raised his eyes. Standing before him were a nurse and a stocky man in a paramedic's uniform. "Come on now, calm down. Now is no time to be thrashing around." The nurse went to hold him down by his shoulders. It dawned on Hanyo that his attempt at suicide had failed. He had consumed a large amount of sedative on the last overground train that evening. To be precise, he gulped it down at a drinking fountain in the station before boarding the train, and no sooner had he stretched out on the empty seats than everything went blank. Suicide was not something he had put much thought into. He considered it likely that his sudden urge to die arose that evening while he was reading the newspaper, the edition for November 29th, at the bar where he normally ate a dinner. It contained the run-of-the-mill sort of stuff, of no special significance. All the articles left him totally cold. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, official is a spy. 3 places raided, including Japan, China, Amity Association. Secretary McNamara transfer, final decision. Smog covers metropolitan area, first winter warning. Haneda Airport explosion, prosecution seek no-limit sentence for Iono's heinous crime. Truck plunges onto railway track, collides with goods wagon. Transplant success, girl receives aortic valve from deceased donor. 900,000 snatched, robbers steal from Kagoshima Bank branch office. He worked as a copywriter, and the jingle in that TV commercial for Goshiki Pharmaceuticals' Fresh and Clear Digestive Aid was one of his. Fresh and clear. Couldn't be simpler. Cured before you know it. People considered him talented enough to strike out on his own, but he lacked any desire to do so. He worked for a company called Tokyo Ad, and the salary they paid him was good enough. Until the previous day, he had personified the honest, hard-working company employee. But when he really thought about it, maybe there was a reason why the idea of suicide had come to him. He had been skimming through the evening paper with such little concentration that the inside page slithered right down under the table. He watched it go, the way an indolent snake might observe its old skin, just shed. The next moment he felt the urge to pick up the page. He could have left it lying there. Perhaps it was social convention that compelled him to retrieve it. Or maybe he was driven by a more serious determination to restore order in the world. He was not exactly sure. In any case, he stooped under the small, wobbly table and stretched out his hand. Just then, his eyes encountered something hideous. On top of the fallen paper was a cockroach, absolutely still. At the very moment he stretched out his hand, the glossy, mahogany-coloured insect scurried away with extraordinary vitality and lost itself among the printed words. He picked up the paper nevertheless, placed the page he'd been reading on the table, and cast his eyes over it again. Suddenly, all the letters he was trying to make out turned into cockroaches. His eyes pursued the letters as they made their escape, their disgustingly shiny, dark red backs in full view. So the world boils down to nothing more than this. It was a sudden revelation, and it was this insight that led to an overwhelming desire to die. But upon further reflection, he found this explanation just a little too pat. Surely things were not so clear-cut. We just have to soldier on, even if every word in the newspaper is reduced to a string of cockroaches. It was in reaction to this thought that the idea of death finally lodged itself in his mind. From that moment, death hung over him, snugly the way snow caps a red postbox after a particularly heavy snowfall. This change in attitude produced some improvement in his spirits. He went into a pharmacy to buy the sedative, but was not quite ready to swallow it down immediately, so he went to watch a triple feature at the movies. When he emerged, he dropped by a pickup bar where he occasionally hung out. The dumpy girl sitting next to him exuded such an overall impression of dullness that he was not tempted in the slightest. Even so, he was afflicted by an urge to confess that he was about to kill himself. He gave her ample elbow a little nudge with his own. The girl stole a glance at him, then lazily turned toward him on her chair as if it required a huge effort. She had the laugh of a country bumpkin. "Good evening," said Hanyo. "Good evening. You're pretty." She giggled. "Do you know what I'm going to say next?" She giggled again. "You can't tell, can you?" "Well, I might have an idea. Later on tonight, I intend to kill myself." Far from being shocked, the girl let out a broad guffaw. She tossed a strip of dried squid right into her mouth and continued to chew for ages, even as she laughed. The stench of the squid clung to the region around Hanyo's nose. Before long, someone, apparently a friend of hers, turned up and the girl waved affectedly in her direction. She disentangled herself from Hanyo's side without so much as a nod. Hanyo also left the bar, alone and curiously irritated that his intention to die had failed to make an impression. The evening was still young, but the appeal of the last train was fixed in his mind, so he had to think of a way to pass the time. He went into a pachinko parlor and started playing at one of the slot machines. He won tons of balls. A human life was about to end, but the balls kept pouring forth in an endless stream. It felt as if someone was making fun of him. Finally, it was time for the last train. Hanyo passed through the ticket barrier, slugged down the sedative at the drinking fountain, and boarded the train. Now that Hanyo had failed to commit suicide, a wonderfully free and empty world opened up before him. From that day on, he made a complete break with the daily grind he had always believed would go on forever. He felt that the world was his for the taking. The days would no longer merge into one. Each day would expire, one after the other. He could see it all clearly before him. A row of dead frogs with their white bellies exposed. He handed in his resignation to Tokyo Ad. The company's business was booming, so they gave him a substantial severance payment. This provided him with a lifestyle that left him beholden to no one. He placed the following advertisement in the Situations Wanted column of a tabloid newspaper. "Life for sale. Use me as you wish. I'm a 27-year-old male. Discretion guaranteed. Will cause no bother at all." He added his apartment address and then stuck a slip of paper onto his front door with the following written on it. The first day, not one person came to his door, but ever since he had stopped work, Hanyo was never at a loss about how to fill the empty hours. He would lounge around his one-room apartment watching television, or lose himself in daydreams. When the ambulance had brought him to accident and emergency, he was out cold, so you would have expected him to have no recollection of what had happened that night. But strangely, the wail of an ambulance siren brought an unmistakable memory of his ride flooding back. He was stretched out on the gurney, snoring loudly. A paramedic in a white gown sat beside him, holding the blanket down in order to prevent the violent lurching of the vehicle from throwing his body from the bed. He saw it as clear as day. The paramedic had a big mole right by the side of his nose. And yet, how empty this new life felt, like a room without furniture. The following morning, there was a knock on the door of the apartment. Hanyo opened it to find a small, neatly dressed old man who, after a few furtive backward glances, hastily entered and shut the door behind him. "I assume you are Mr. Hanyo Yamada." "That is correct." I saw your ad in the newspaper. Oh, please come through. Hanio led him inside to a corner of the red-carpeted room that he had furnished with a black table and chairs, the kind you might expect to see in the home of someone employed in the design world. The old man issued a cobra-like hiss through his teeth as he politely bowed and took a seat. So you're the one whose life is for sale? Yes, I am. Well, you're obviously young and making a decent living. What makes you want to do this? Don't ask things that don't concern you. Even so, how much are you selling your life for? That depends on how much you are willing to give. That's highly irresponsible of you. Surely you should set your own price on what your life is worth. What would you do if I offered 100 yen? If that's what you want, it's fine by me. Come on, that's a ridiculous thing to say. The old man took out a wallet from his breast pocket and produced 5 crisp-looking 10,000 yen notes. He spread them out in the shape of a fan as if they were playing cards. There was no emotion in Hanio's eyes as he pocketed the 50,000 yen. You can tell me anything you like. I won't be offended. Okay. The old man took out some filtered cigarettes. You get lung cancer if you smoke these. Fancy one? I don't suppose a man who is selling his life worries about cancer. It's a very simple matter. My wife, well, actually, she's my third, is now 23 years old. There is exactly half a century in age between us. She's a magnificent woman, you know. Her breasts, they point in different directions, like 2 doves miffed with each other, and her lips are sweet and full, pouting and inviting. I can't begin to describe how amazing her body is, and she has great legs. There seems to be a fashion now for women to have abnormally slender legs. Too slender, if you ask me. But hers taper off ever so gently from her fleshy thighs all the way down to her ankles. It's hard to find the right words. Her buttocks are shaped like little mounds that remind you of molehills. Well, she's left me, and she's doing the rounds with whoever takes her fancy. Right now she's shacked up with some shady Asian guy, a Chinese or a Korean. He's a mobster, but not your ordinary run-of-the-mill mobster. He's the owner of no fewer than 4 restaurants, and I'm sure he's knocked off a couple of people in turf wars. What I'm asking is that you acquaint yourself with my wife, become intimate, and make sure that this mobster finds the pair of you at it. When he claps eyes on you, you're sure to get killed, and she'll probably be dead meat too. Well, that's my way of getting even. That's all there is to it. Could you manage to die like that for me? I see. Hanio listened, affecting an air of indifference. Then he asked, But I wonder if it will have such a romantic ending. I appreciate your dreaming about taking revenge on your wife, but what if she's more than willing to die a happy death because she's with me? She's definitely not the kind of woman with a death wish. She's different from you in that sense. She wants to squeeze every last drop she can get out of life. It's as if every fibre of her body has been written through with some sort of magic spell. What makes you say that? You'll know soon enough. In any event, I would appreciate a neat death. I assume a written agreement is unnecessary. That's right. It won't be required. More hissing sounds emerged from the old man's lips. He was clearly mulling things over. Is there anything you'd like me to make arrangements for after your death? No, not particularly. I don't want a funeral, and I don't need a grave. But there is one thing that maybe you could do for me. I've always wanted to keep a Siamese cat as a pet, but I've never got around to it. So after I'm dead, I'd be grateful if you could get one and take care of it on my behalf. In my mind, I envisage you letting it drink milk from a large ladle rather than a saucer. After it laps up the first couple of mouthfuls, you should give the ladle a slight flip so that the milk splashes up and the cat's face gets a good soaking. It would be good if you could do that once a day. This is really important, so I'd like you not to forget. What a weird thing to ask. You only think that because you inhabit an exceptionally ordinary world. A request like this is way beyond your powers of imagination. Before I forget, if I happen to come back alive, does the 50,000 yen have to be returned? It just won't happen. All I ask is that you make sure my wife bites the bullet when the moment arises. So it's a murder contract? I guess so. Look, I just want to ensure that we rub out every trace of her from this world. What I don't want is to feel any guilt. It's just not worth putting myself through the mill and then feeling remorseful on top of that. So we're agreed. I'd like you to get started tonight. I'll pay incidental expenses whenever you make a claim. Where do I go to get started? Here's a map. It's apartment 865 in this fancy apartment block at the top of the hill called Villa Borghese. I believe it's the penthouse on the top floor. I have no idea when she'll be in. Beyond that, you'll just have to play it by ear. What's your wife's name? Ruriko Kishi. Ruriko is written in simple hiragana script. Kishi is the same Chinese character used by Prime Minister Kishi in his name. The old man looked strangely radiant as he spoke. The old man turned to leave, but scarcely had he stepped out of the door than he was back again. The words that followed were entirely to be expected from someone who had purchased another's life. Ah, I forgot something important. You must tell no one. Not only that I'm your client, but also about your mission. After all, you're selling your life, so a certain level of commercial decorum is involved. You have nothing to fear on that point. So you really won't sign a written oath? Don't be ridiculous. To do that would be tantamount to making a public declaration of our arrangement. I see what you mean. The old man was clearly troubled as he shuffled back into the room, still hissing through his ill-fitting false teeth. In which case, how can I trust you? Those who believe everything, while those who doubt don't believe a thing. Look, you've come and given me money, haven't you? That leaves me convinced that such a thing as trust still exists in the world. And anyway, even if I were to publicize the mission you've entrusted me with, I don't have a clue who you are or where you come from. Doesn't that give you peace of mind? Don't be dumb. Ruriko will spill the beans. I know that for sure. Maybe she will, but I'm not the blabbing kind. I can see that. I've known a lot of people over the years. The moment I clapped eyes on you, I knew you'd fit the bill. If you need any more money, leave me a message on the information board at the central exit of Shinjuku Station. Short and sweet will do. Waiting for money, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Life. Something like that. I like to take a stroll around the department stores every day, but it's all a bit boring before opening time. So if you want to meet during the morning, earlier is better. The old man turned to go. As he stepped out of the door, Hanyo was right behind him. "Where are you off to?" the old man inquired. "Obvious, isn't it? Apartment 865, Villa Borghese. Now that's what I call keen." Hanyo remembered to turn over the card on the door on which he had written "Life for Sale." On the other side was the single word, "Sold." Villa Borghese was a white, Italianate building that dominated the hill in a squalid part of town. You couldn't miss it, so there was no need for Hanyo to consult the map. He peeped through the reception window, but the concierge was not in his chair. The hallway was deserted, so he made a beeline for the elevator, visible at the rear. He walked involuntarily, as if pulled by a thread, bemused by an incongruous sense of cheerful irresponsibility as a man about to commit suicide. His life overflowed with lightness. He reached the 8th floor, where the corridor was enveloped in the deep hush of mid-morning, and quickly found the door to apartment 865. As he pushed the bell, pleasant chimes reverberated within. Maybe they were out. But Hanyo somehow knew Ruriko would be at home on her own that morning. Now was just the time when a kept woman, having sent her man off for the day, would be back in bed sound asleep. It was this thought that kept Hanyo's finger pressed firmly on the bell. Finally, there were signs of someone coming to the door. When it opened, the chain lock was still attached to its track. The bemused face of a young woman peered through the gap. She was wearing a nightdress, but showed no sign of having just woken up. Her expression was vivid and sharply focused. Sure enough, her lips pouted invitingly. "Who are you?" "I'm from Life for Sale. I wonder if you might be interested in life insurance." "Thank you, but we have lots already. We don't need any more insurance." The fact that, despite her blunt words, she did not immediately shut the door in his face convinced him that her interest must be piqued. He had already employed the salesman's trick of wedging a foot in the doorway. "I don't have to come in. I would just like you to hear me out. It won't take a moment." "No. My husband will get mad at me. And besides, I'm not presentable right now." "Well then, I'll come again, in 20 minutes' time." "Let me think." She was mulling it over. "Why don't you go and make some other calls? Then ring my bell again in 20 minutes. "Thank you. I'll do that." He withdrew his foot, and she closed the door. Hanyo sat on a sofa by a window at the end of the corridor and waited for 20 minutes. From there, he commanded a view of the neighborhood bathed in winter sunshine. In the bright light, it was all too clear that the area was distinctly the worse for wear, as if nibbled away by termites. Of course, the locals would not fail to keep up appearances, addressing each other with a "good morning," or asking how work was going, or inquiring into the health of their wives and children. Or they might remark on the ratcheting up of the international situation. But none of them would notice the sheer banality of their words. After smoking a couple of cigarettes, he went and knocked again. This time the door was flung open, and the woman, now dressed in a light green suit with a splayed collar, courteously invited him in. "Would you like tea? Or something stronger? You're treating me very well for a door-to-door salesman. There's no way you're in insurance. I could tell the moment I saw you. If you're going to put on an act, you need to do it a bit better than that." "Fair enough. In which case, could I trouble you for a beer?" Ruriko laughed with a twinkle in her eye and sashayed across the room, drawing attention to her hips, which were quite wide, despite the slimness of her figure. She disappeared into the kitchen. Presently, the pair were clinking beer glasses at the living-room table. "So, who on earth are you?" asked Ruriko. "Let's just say I am the milkman." "You're teasing me. Still, I assume you knew of the risks you're taking when you came here." "No." "So who asked you to come?" "Nobody." "That is strange. So you're telling me that you rang the bell on the off chance that a regular glamour-puss like me might be at home? That just about sums it up. You're a lucky man. Now, I'm afraid I don't have any nibbles. I wonder if it's odd to have chips with beer so early in the morning. Ah, I think there should be some cheese." She hurried off to search the refrigerator again. "Ooh, that's cold!" Her voice carried from the other room. She returned with a dish of salad, with something dark on the lettuce leaves. "Do help yourself." For some reason, though, she approached him from the rear. The next moment, something icy cold was jabbed into Hanyo's cheek from behind. A single glance told him it was a gun. He was not particularly surprised. "I bet that's freezing," she said. "It certainly is. Do you keep it in the fridge?" "I do, because I hate warm weapons. You're quite the fussy one, aren't you? Aren't you afraid?" "Not particularly. You think you can play with me because I'm a woman. But look, I'm going to give you plenty of time to fess up, so drink your beer and say your prayers." Ruriko cautiously withdrew the gun and walked all the way round him to sit on the chair opposite. The gun remained cocked and pointed in his direction. Hanyo held the beer glass in his hand, which remained absolutely steady. But what intrigued him was the faint quiver in Ruriko's hand. "That's quite some disguise you've got there," she said. I bet you're Chinese or Korean. How many years have you been in Japan? Give me a break. I'm a Japanese, the genuine article. Liar! You're snooping for my husband. I know it. I bet your real name is Kin or Lee or something like that. May I ask what you base this delusion of yours upon? You're a cool one. So you're not going to be straight with me, in which case, I guess my only choice is to spell out once more what I'm sure you already know. My husband is jealous as hell, and last night I was under suspicion yet again for no reason at all. I was in a really sticky situation, but in the end he arranged for his goon to keep an eye on me. Even so, it wasn't enough for him just to keep watch from a distance. He's testing me, I know, getting someone to sneak into the house to try and seduce me, isn't he? Well, I won't have it. Take one step my way, and I'll shoot. But come to think of it, he was the one who gave me a gun for my own protection, and it was he who made a point of ensuring I could use it properly. You know, it might just be that you've been roped into something completely unawares. Maybe you're the one who's fallen into a trap. I bet you had no idea that you've been selected for the role of getting yourself bumped off by me so I can prove what a virtuous woman I am. You don't say. Hanyo played it cool and looked her straight in the eye. Well, if I'm going to be killed anyway, I'd prefer to sleep together first. If we do, I promise, I won't kick up any fuss when you kill me afterward. Ruriko's gradually rising fury flared across Hanyo's field of vision. It was like reading a map where the contour lines suddenly bunched together. I've heard that before. You might even be from the ACS. ACS? Is that the name of a TV station? Don't play cute with me. I'm talking about the Asia Confidential Service. You've completely lost me now. But of course, I almost fell for it. I very nearly killed someone, and that would have landed me in my husband's clutches for the rest of my life. He's dreamt up some romantic scheme to get me back as his little floozy, hasn't he? First he arranges for me to protect my virtue by killing someone. And since he's one of only 5 people in Japan capable of giving shelter to killers, he intends to keep me under lock and key for the rest of my days. Now that's scary. If you really are from the ACS, tell me now. Convinced she had hit the nail on the head, Ruriko flung the gun onto the cushion next to her. You should have said earlier that you were from the ACS. That name again. Rather than deny it, Hanyo decided to play along. So you're one of his stooges too, are you? Ruriko went on. And your cover was a life insurance alias. I had no idea. In that case, even he might have let me into it beforehand. But what an appalling actor you are. You must be new to the ACS, right? How many months' training have you received? 6 months. That's not very long, so you managed to get fluent in all those Southeast Asian languages, including all the Chinese dialects, in such a short time. Uh-huh. He was reduced to giving nothing but vague responses. Still, you've shown some real guts. I'm impressed. Ruriko's expression relaxed. She stood up and went to gaze out over the balcony, where there was a garden chair, its white paint peeling, with a garden table of the same design. Rain from the previous day still clung in quivering drops from the edge of the tabletop. So how many pounds did he ask you to transport? Stumped by what to say, Hanyo replied, I can't tell you that. And then he yawned. After all, the gold in Laos is dirt cheap. With the Vientiane market price as it is, you would at least double your profits if you brought it to Tokyo. A previous ACS man did something really clever. He dissolved gold in nitrohydrochloric acid and brought it in as a dozen bottles of Scotch whisky. Then he turned it back into gold. Can you imagine that? Sounds very far-fetched to me. Yeah, the shoes I'm wearing today look like crocodile skin, but underneath what's visible to the eye, they're actually gold. My feet feel quite cold. Those shoes, you mean? Ruriko leaned over to examine Hanyo's feet with unalloyed curiosity, but she saw no trace of any weighty, glittering gold. Meanwhile, Hanyo's eyes were drawn like a magnet to the deep cleft between her breasts, which, ill-partnered though they were, pressed urgently against each other in that valley of powdered whiteness. They did indeed point in different directions, as the old man had said. Ruriko seemed to have applied talc to the region. A kiss there would be like burying your nose in baby powder. Hanyo could well imagine. So tell me, how do you go about importing American weapons into Japan via Laos? Ruriko went on. Do you have to make a stopover in Hong Kong? That's a real pain. Surely it'd be much simpler to go to the military base in Tachikawa and get some there. That place is chock-a-block with weapons from America. Hanyo cut in with a question of his own. By the way, what time does your husband get back? He'll drop by for a while around lunchtime. Didn't he tell you? Well, I timed it to get here a bit early. So how about having a little lie-down together before he actually arrives? Hanyo gave another yawn and removed his jacket. My, you are tired, aren't you? You can use my husband's bed. I'd much prefer yours. Without warning, Hanyo grabbed hold of Ruriko. Ruriko struggled to get out of his grasp, and in the process she managed to clutch hold of the gun with her outstretched hand. You fool! Do you want to get your head blown off? She cried. Either way, I end up dead. It's all the same to me. Well, that's not true for me. If I shoot you dead right now, I'll at least get away with my life. But if we're in bed together when he gets here, then it'll be curtains for the both of us. I know which option I'd prefer. Okay, let me ask you something. Do you know what happens to a person who kills an ACS man for no reason? Ruriko turned pale and shook her head. Hanyo strode up to the display shelf and picked up a Swiss national doll. He delivered a chop to its spine, then bent the doll back so far in his hands that it snapped in two. Hanyo was first to strip down, and as he slipped between the sheets, he thought over the course of action he should take. The key is to keep it going as long as possible. The longer we're in the sack, the better the chance that her guy will burst in on us and shoot us both dead. If they were killed in the middle of it all, that would be a great way to go. That was how he saw it. If he were old, it might be a source of shame, but for a young man there could be no greater honour than to die on the job. Of course, the ideal was to remain entirely unaware of impending death until the instant it happened, allowing him to plunge instantaneously from the height of ecstasy to the abyss of annihilation. But for Hanyo, this was simply not an option. He would have to stretch things out in the full knowledge that he was about to die. For most people, the sheer terror of this thought would be a hindrance to sexual pleasure, but not so for Hanyo. He would be dead even before his mouth had time to drop open in shock. And since this was not his first brush with death, it was no big deal. Until he reached that point, all that mattered was to live each moment of life as it came, to savour it fully and for as long as it lasted. Ruriko seemed unfazed. She fiddled around with the Venetian blinds, closing them partially, but left the curtains open. Then she stripped off unceremoniously in the aquarium blue light. In the gap of the bathroom door, which she'd purposely left ajar. He got a full view of her naked form in the mirror as she sprayed perfume under her arms and dabbed some behind her ears. The rounded contours of her shoulders and buttocks brought delicious embraces to mind. Stirred by the sight, Hanyo could hardly believe what was happening. Walking gracefully around the bed once, naked, she finally slipped in beside him. Hanyo was aware it would not constitute good pillow talk, but he could not suppress his curiosity. Why on earth did you circle round the bed like that? It's a ritual of mine. You know, dogs often do the same thing before they lie down. It's a kind of instinct. You're really something. Come on now, we haven't got all day. Take me in your arms." Ruriko's words sounded heavy as, eyes closed, she grasped Hanyo's head in her hands. Hanyo's strategy was to maintain things for as long as possible by keeping her constantly on the edge. He intended to devote lots of time to trying one thing, then go back to the starting point, to try something else, and return once more to the beginning. But once he began his first foray, he was surprised at the unexpected turn of events. Ruriko's body was certainly worthy of all the old man's deep attachment. As a result, Hanyo's plan almost ended in failure, but he stood his ground. His one concern was to ensure that Ruriko didn't get distracted, that she remained fully focused on what they were up to, even as the threat of death pressed in. To this end, Hanyo employed all the tricks at his disposal. By flooding her with a sense of regret that it might be about to end, by keeping her in suspense and enthralled by the knowledge that it was not over yet. He took pride in his expert ability to carve out small rest breaks for this very purpose. Ruriko's entire body flushed pink, and as she lay on the bed, it was plain that she was caught in a complete limbo. She was a prisoner trying to cling desperately with her eyes to the ceiling light, only to find her attention slipping away from it again. Hanyo went on the attack, then rested, then attacked again. But every effort brought him closer to falling into the beguiling trap of Ruriko's body. The only way he could avoid giving in to the moment was to try to devote all his attention to his companion's fantasies as they gradually took physical shape before him. Vigorously applying himself to his task, Hanyo heard a key turn softly in the apartment door. Ruriko noticed nothing. Her eyes shut tight as she swung her faintly damp face from side to side. So, this is it, thought Hanyo. Any second now, a gun fixed with a silencer would create a small red tunnel right through his back, straight into Ruriko's chest. He heard the sound of the door being closed softly. Someone was in the apartment, he knew that much. But nothing happened. Hanyo found it too much effort to look over his shoulder. Indeed, if this really was the last moment left to him, it seemed only right to put everything he had into it. Should death visit at that very instant, even better. It was not as if his whole life had been building up to this moment, but he made the very best of it by strenuously flinging himself into Ruriko's exquisite trap, giving full vent to the feelings of insatiable lust for this windfall of a gift. Since nothing happened even after their tremors had subsided, he arched his neck up, snake-like, and turned around, still resting on top of her body. A fat, odd-looking man, dressed in a fancy apricot-coloured jacket and sporting a beret, met his eyes. He was sitting by the table where Hanyo had earlier shared a drink with Ruriko. A large sketchbook was open on his knees, and his pencil was moving furiously. "Stay as you are. Don't move," he said gently, before shifting his gaze back to the page. At the sound of his voice, Ruriko gave a start. Hanyo was taken aback by the visceral terror in her face. Ruriko yanked the sheet toward her, wrapping it around her body, and sat up. Completely exposed, Hanyo had no option but to lie there, casting glances first at Ruriko and then at the man. "Why didn't you shoot? Why didn't you just kill us?" Ruriko screamed in a shrill voice. She began to sob. "Don't tell me! You're going to keep our feet to the fire, aren't you, for as long as you can? Don't get in a tizzy. Calm down." The man spoke Japanese in an odd accent. He threw himself even further into his pencil work and totally ignored Hanyo. "I'm just making a sketch of you. I think it's going to turn out well. The way both of you moved was beautiful. I'm having an artistic moment, so both of you just stay as you are for a bit longer, please." Hanyo and Ruriko were both rendered speechless. "There. Finished." The man closed the sketchbook, removed his beret, and placed them both on the table. He went up to the bed, hands on hips, as if he were a primary school teacher, admonishing a couple of kids. "Come on now, put your clothes on. You'll catch cold otherwise." Still utterly bemused, Hanyo donned the clothes he had earlier discarded with such abandon. Ruriko, wrapped in the sheet, rose indignantly to her feet and stormed into the bathroom. The sheet got caught in the door behind her. so she jerked it inside with an angry mutter. The door slammed shut. The man spoke. "Please, join me. Do you fancy a drink?" Hanyo reluctantly joined him at the table. "That woman takes ages getting ready. She'll be in the bathroom at least 30 minutes. We have no option but to wait. You should have a drink, then do the grown-up thing and go home." As he spoke, the man took out a pre-bottled Manhattan mix from the fridge, daintily placed a cherry in each cocktail glass, then poured out the drink from a height. The plumpness of his hands gave the impression of boundless generosity. There were even dimples in the joints of his fingers. "By the way, I'm not going to bother asking who you are. What difference would it make anyway?" Ruriko thought I might be a member of the ACS. You may not be aware of this, but the ACS only exists in thriller mangas. Truth be told, I'm very much a peace-loving guy. I wouldn't harm a fly. But she has a problem. She suffers from sexual frigidity, so I have to make up all sorts of scenarios in order to give her a kick and spice things up a bit. That way she's satisfied and she gets to brandish a toy gun under the illusion. It's the real thing. I'm a complete pacifist at heart, you know. I think it's vital for people of every country to get along peacefully and help each other through foreign trade and commerce. It's not so much the harming of people's bodies I find objectionable, but of their hearts. That, I believe, is the key lesson humanism has to teach us. Wouldn't you agree? Oh yes, absolutely. Hanyo barely knew how to respond. But she's got no time for my pacifism. The girl craves thrills, pure and simple, and now she's hooked on thriller mangas. So I have to play along with her. We pretend I've bumped off loads of people. I fill her head with ideas like the ACS. She loves it, and that helps her overcome her frigidity, so I let her remain a prisoner to her fantasies. I see. But why me? No need to feel guilty. You gave pleasure to Ruriko. That also puts me in your debt, so I have no reason to reproach you. Care for another drink? And then, once you've finished, you'd better go straight home, and don't come here again. I'd hate to end up feeling jealous, but I managed to get a really good drawing out of what just happened. Here, take a look. The man opened up his sketchbook. It was an example of what they call a motion portrait, drawn to an almost professional standard. Though Hanyo was the object of the study, even he was overwhelmed by the strangely beautiful purity of what it depicted, giving the impression of lithe young animals absorbed in an act of untrammeled ferocity. It was motion itself, people overflowing with pleasure, bright, engrossed in a vigorous dance. The picture gave no hint of the subtle calculations at work within Hanyo's own consciousness. "Great picture," Hanyo responded, in genuine admiration, as he returned the sketchbook. "Not bad, eh? When people are happy, they are always at their most beautiful, I think. They're completely at peace with themselves. I have no desire to get in the way of that. It's perfection itself. I'm glad I managed to get it down on paper. Now, you should leave, before Ruriko comes out of the bathroom." The man stood up and held out his hand. It looked so soft and squashy that Hanyo was reluctant to shake it, but it was time for him to go. "Goodbye, then," said Hanyo, and moved toward the door. Just then, he felt a hand on his shoulder. "You're still young," said the man. "You must forget everything that happened just now. You understand me, right? What went on today, right here, the people you met, you should forget it all. You get me? That way, you'll be left with nothing but good memories. Think of these words as my parting gift to take with you for the rest of your life. Make the most of it." Hanyo emerged into the bright outdoors with what had struck him as extremely sound, sensible advice still ringing in his ears. Even he felt that this morning's experience was a mad fantasy. He had intended to play the nihilist until, that is, the wisdom of the older man had enlightened him. It was as if he had been instantaneously transformed into a proper adult. Until that moment, the man had been treating him with kid gloves as if he were still a child. As he walked along the winter streets, it occurred to him that someone might be tailing him. He looked back, but there was no one there. To think that he, of all people, had been taken in by some thriller manga. And he was probably not the only one. His client, the old man with the hiss, had probably fallen for it too. A new snack bar had opened up nearby, so he went in for a break. He ordered a coffee and a hot dog. The waitress brought him his food, the glistening fresh hot dog sausage, peeking out between the two halves of the bun, along with some French mustard. Hanyo couldn't help asking, "Are you free this evening?" She was a thin, hard-looking girl. She wore heavy evening makeup, even though it was still early in the day. And from the resolute line of her lips, she seemed determined not to smile ever in her life. "It's still daytime. That's why I'm asking if you're free this evening. But I still don't know how the evening is going to pan out today." "Oh, you mean you're a bit in the dark about the future?" "That's right. We don't even know what's going to happen in 15 minutes. That's going a bit far, isn't it? Dividing everything up into such short spans of time." "Well, that's what they do on television. Every 15 minutes, there are breaks for commercials. That way, we get to look forward to what's coming next. That's how it works in real life, too." She laughed out loud as she walked off. He had, in short, been given the cold shoulder. But Hanyo was not bothered. The girl clearly modelled her life on television. Not having to think too far ahead probably made everything certain, precise, and safe. And she could keep her options open. With a commercial break due to come on every 15 minutes, why on earth should she commit herself to something arranged for so much later in the day? There was nothing else to do but to return to his apartment, but Hanyo drifted about from place to place, trying all the same to spend as little money as possible. It was night by the time he got back home. The 50,000 yen was tucked inside his breast pocket, but he could not help thinking he ought to hand back the money. When would the old man appear next? Until he did turn up, and they had settled accounts, he still had financial ownership of Hanyo's life, so it was best to leave the sold sign posted on his apartment door. That night Hanyo slept soundly. Next morning he heard footsteps, which stopped outside his apartment. But whoever it was apparently saw the card, because the footsteps then went away with no knock on the door. It might be a hitman, he suddenly thought. But no, that was unlikely. No need to think he was in some spurious thriller story. The water for his morning coffee came to the boil as he faced his reflection in the wall mirror. What a fool he was! He stuck out his tongue in a crude gesture. The whole of the next day, Hanyo was surprised how anxiously he awaited the old man. He wanted to meet him as soon as possible and get his life sorted out one way or another. A sale was a sale. The man surely out to give a bit more attention to what he'd bought. It occurred to Hanyo that the old fellow might turn up while he happened to be out, so he remained indoors the whole day. The wintry sun went down. The concierge was in the habit of delivering the evening paper himself, and he slipped it under the door after dusk had settled. Hanyo opened the paper to an article on page 3, and was startled to see a huge picture of Ruriko's face. "Beauty found drowned in Sumida River. Suicide or murder unclear. Name card Ruriko Kishi. Address unknown. Discovered in handbag left by side of bridge." The article went on to paint the incident in lurid colours. The news in the paper about Ruriko's death left Hanyo dumbstruck, and at this very moment the old man chose to pay a visit. He almost came tumbling into the apartment, such was his excitement. "You did it! Fantastic! Well done! And you got away without dying after all. Now that's what I call real business acumen. I'm so happy, so happy." He cavorted around the room. Irritated, Hanyo grabbed him by the collar. "Get out of here right now! I'm returning your 50,000, so just take it," he said, and thrust the money into the old man's pocket. "You used that money to buy my life, but I'm still alive, so I'm under no obligation to keep it." "Hey, wait a minute. Not so fast. Why not tell me what happened before we decide on anything?" The old man dug his feet in and flapped his hands about in stiff resistance to being manhandled by Hanyo. He grabbed hold of the inside door handle and rattled it about so loudly that Hanyo feared that the other residents might emerge from their apartments. Finally prized away from the door handle, the old man sank to the floor, hissing through his teeth even more noisily than before. Crawling to a chair, he hoisted himself up onto it, his dignity restored at last. "You shouldn't rough people up like that, especially someone my age." Noticing the bills shoved into his pocket, he pulled them out angrily and deposited them in a large cut-glass ashtray. Hanyo watched with interest, half expecting the old man to set fire to them with a match, but he showed no sign of doing so. The crumpled bills began unfurling in the ashtray, like the petals of some dirty artificial flower coming into bloom. "Surely you can understand why I'm delighted. Even a youngster like you ought to be able to grasp how Ruriko made me suffer, how she treated me with utter contempt. That woman deserved her comeuppance. I assume you did sleep with her?" Hanyo felt his face flush, and he had to glance away. "Bullseye, right? So you did get it on. Well, she's quite something, don't you think? Everyone hates her after they've shared her bed, because relations with all other women pale in comparison. I guess I should come clean and say that I'm actually too old now to get it up, even with her. And when a man gets that desperate about a woman, what other option is there but to finish her off? That's a rather simplistic way of thinking about things. So, you're the one that killed her." "Hey, don't get funny with me. If I were capable of doing that myself, why come and ask you?" "No, the one who bumped her off. So it was murder, plain and simple, was it? What else could it be but murder?" For the life of me, I can't help clinging to the idea that it all came about by mistake, through a series of miscalculations, and for that reason I'm thinking of returning to that apartment tomorrow. Don't even think of it. The police will be keeping a watch on the place, you can be sure. Do you seriously intend to let yourself get caught up in that? I really hope not. I guess you're right. It wouldn't be worth it, Hanyo knew. There was clearly little point in returning to the apartment now, especially since her body would no longer be there. But he was pretty sure that Gun would still be chilling in the fridge. "But, you know—" For the first time, Hanyo loosened up and felt that he wanted to give the old man a detailed account of his experience. The old man continued to make hissing sounds through his teeth as he listened, seemingly unaware that he was also betraying the lingering habits of his foppish youth. He played nervously with the knot of his tie and softly stroked what little hair he had left with hands that were spotted with age. He glanced out through the window, where his attention seemed to be drawn to a withered willow tree beneath the eaves of 2 adjoining houses. It caught the light reflected from the windows and was bending in the cold night breeze. As he waited for Hanyo to continue, the old man appeared lost in memories of his own bygone pleasures. "I do find the fact that I wasn't killed amazing," Hanyo went on. "Do you think there'd be a problem if I became a witness after the event? Haven't you got it yet? That guy clearly came back with the express aim of killing Ruriko. You just happened to be in the way, don't you see? Most likely she'd drained him of every ounce of physical energy until he couldn't take it anymore. If he'd killed you both, there and then, he would have been sending you off together and losing her to another man for good. That's why he deliberately made a point of killing her alone, in a way that would keep her all to himself. Of course, what he saw you both up to would no doubt have hardened his resolve. But is he really the murderer? He just didn't look the type. How blind can you be? That guy's a mobster and a notorious gangland boss. Even if you did become a witness, he'd find some way of wriggling out of the clutches of the law. Right at this moment, he's most probably putting on some brazen display in that very apartment, crying and yelling over Ruriko's death. It hardly needs me to tell you murder cases always soon get forgotten. So it's best that the matter remains unsolved. But I appreciate that you threw yourself into your work without poking your nose into things that don't concern you. Here, let me give you another 50,000 as a little celebratory bonus. The old man tossed another 10,000 yen notes into the ashtray and prepared to go home. Well, I suppose this is the last we will see of each other, said Hanyo. I hope so. I don't suppose Ruriko mentioned me at all. Hanyo could not resist a teasing reply. Well, she did and she didn't. What? The old man turned pale. Don't tell me she let on about my personal details. I'm not sure about that. Are you trying to blackmail me? Even if I were, it's not as if you are guilty of any crime in law, right? That's true. All you and I did was to try and turn the gears of this perilous world a tiny bit. Normally, such a minor thing would have had no effect at all. But no sooner had I decided it was worth throwing my life away for it than a murder scene materialized, seemingly out of thin air. That's amazing, wouldn't you say? You're a weird one. You have as much heart as a vending machine. That's right. Stick a coin in me and you get out what you paid for. It's all or nothing when it comes to machines. Can a human really behave so like a robot? Quite a revelation, isn't it? Hanyo's broad grin was met with a horrified look. So how much do you want? If I want anything, I'll get in touch, but I don't need any more money from you today. The old man escaped through the door to make his getaway. Hanyo called after him. And you can forget about the Siamese cat. After all, I'm alive. Reaching round the door, he turned the card back to the side that read, Life for Sale. Then he retreated inside with a yawn. He was a man who had already died once. There was no reason why he should feel any sense of responsibility or attachment to the world. To him, it was nothing more than a sheet of newspaper covered in the scribblings of cockroaches. So, how did Ruriko fit in? Ruriko's body had been discovered. The police must be running around looking for the culprit. No one had caught sight of him in Villa Borghese, of that he was sure, and he hadn't met anyone during the 20 minutes he waited in the corridor. When he left the building, no one seemed to be tailing him back to his apartment. In short, he had slipped back into the world with all the commotion of a wisp of smoky. Why would he be summoned as a potential suspect? The only uncertain part was if the old man got hauled in by the police and mentioned his name. But this was really not worth worrying about. After all, the old man was clearly wary of having anything to do with Hanyo. So even if Hanyo had been the murderer, the case would very likely run into the ground. At this point in his thoughts, Hanyo shuddered. Could he be sure that he wasn't the murderer? Considering how bizarre the whole episode had been, what if he had unconsciously fallen victim to the hypnotic powers of that strange man in the beret, and had ended up doing away with Ruriko? Maybe he'd done it during the night when he was in a deep sleep. Could his decision to put his life up for sale be linked to the murder? No, that was a crazy idea. It had nothing to do with him. Nothing at all. He'd cut all his ties with human society long ago, hadn't he? But if that were true, what to make of these sweet memories of Ruriko that returned to him again and again? What did it mean that he had experienced such intense physical pleasure with her? Had the woman named Ruriko actually ever existed? He was determined not to worry about his part in it all. It would only make him ill. Itadadiu, how could he entertain himself this evening? A man who had managed to sell his life for 100,000 yen once would surely be able to sell it again. Hanyo was in no mood to do anything as mundane as having a drink. On a sudden impulse, he took out a stuffed toy mouse with a funny face from the cupboard. Some time ago, a girl who made this kind of handicraft had presented it to him as a gift. The mouse had a pointed snout, like a fox, with a few wispy hairs at the tip of its nose. It was a rather commonplace design, with tiny eyes made from black beads. One curious feature was that the mouse was clad in a lunatic's straitjacket. A strong white sheet bound both his paws together tightly against his chest so that they couldn't budge an inch. On the front of the jacket were some words written in English. Beware. Patient, prone to violence. Hanyo put the mouse's inertness down entirely to the straitjacket. Taking his reasoning to its logical conclusion, he decided that the very ordinariness and nondescript nature of its mousy face was actually proof of its lunacy. Right then, Moosikins. His words elicited no response. Maybe the mouse had a misanthropic streak. This was not exactly the moment to dwell on the difference between country and city rodents, but he had the feeling this was a mouse from the sticks that had been tricked by some sly Tokyo cousin into changing its abode and had ended up getting crushed under the huge pressure of life in the big city. Worn down by its meaningless solitary existence, it had ended up developing a propensity to violence. Hanyo decided to share a leisurely evening meal with it. He sat the mouse on the opposite side of the table, tucked a napkin into the top of its straitjacket, and left it there while he prepared the meal. The demented mouse sat bolt upright as it waited. After giving some thought to what he might serve the mouse, Hanyo prepared bits of cheese and small pieces of steak that it could nibble easily with its sharp teeth. He also made a portion for himself and sat down. "Okay, Moosikins, grubs up. Don't stand on ceremony." Despite his encouragement, there was no reply. Apparently, the demented mouse also suffered from an eating disorder. "Hey, why no eating? After all the effort I put into the cooking, don't you like it?" Sure enough, no reply. "Maybe you need some music playing while you eat. You like your luxuries, don't you? Let me put on a quiet piece that might be to your taste." He got up from the table and put Debussy's La Cathédrale Engloutie on the stereo. The mouse remained sullen and tight-lipped. "You're an odd one. You're a mouse, so you should be able to eat without using your paws." No reply. Hanyo suddenly flew into a rage. "So you don't like my cooking? Right then, this is what you get." He knocked over the small plate of steak and shoved the mouse's face into the food. The shock sent the mouse tipping back effortlessly over his chair onto the floor. Hanyo picked the mouse up in his fingers. "What's this? Are you dead? Doesn't take much to kill you. You're pathetic. Well, what have you got to say for yourself? Don't expect a proper funeral. I doubt you're even worth a single night's wake. You're just a mouse, an ordinary little mouse. Why don't you simply shrivel up into a husk in some filthy hole? You were absolutely worthless while you were alive. You're equally worthless now you're dead." Picking up the dead mouse, he threw it back into the cupboard. He sampled the tiny slices of steak left by the mouse. They tasted delicious, like meaty sweets. Hanyo thought things through, listening to Debussy's Submerged Cathedral. A bystander might have seen this as a pathetic game played by a lonely person, desperate to be rescued from his loneliness. But how sad it would be to see loneliness as an enemy. It was his unconditional ally, no doubt about it. At that moment, there was a stealthy knock on the door. He opened it to find an utterly nondescript, middle-aged woman, her hair pulled back in a bun. "I've come in response to your newspaper ad." "I see. Please come in. I'm in the middle of eating, but I'll be finished soon." "Sorry to trouble you." The woman stepped in gingerly, looking around as she did so. Was there any endeavour more worthy than to purchase a person's life? So why did all the clients who came to his place look so furtive? As he ate, Hanyo stole glances in the woman's direction. From the inelegant way she wore her kimono, he sensed she was no ordinary housewife. More like an elderly spinster, perhaps, someone who taught English literature at a girls' college of higher education. She would have nothing but vivacious young students in her care, and the fact that they were all the same sex would make her even more determined to stand out by positively letting herself go to seed. It's often the case that such women are much younger than they appear. To tell the truth, every day I've been making my way surreptitiously to your front door, but you've had that card up saying sold all the time, as you know. What does that word mean? If that were the real state of affairs, it would mean you were dead. Even today, I had more or less resigned myself to the fact that it would be hopeless, but I still came. I was so relieved to see the card turned over to the side with "Life for Sale" written on it. Yes, I managed to complete the job I was assigned. I sold my life, but as you see, I am still alive. Hanyo brought in 2 cups of coffee from the kitchenette, one for the woman. So, why have you come to see me? It's a little embarrassing for me to tell you. You have nothing to worry about, believe me. You can say that, but it's embarrassing nevertheless. After a short pause, the woman discarded all reticence and looked directly at Hanyo. If you sell me your life, this time you probably won't be able to return home alive. Are you happy with that? When Hanyo failed to turn a hair, the woman looked deflated. Sipping the coffee with puckered lips, she repeated her warning, but this time with an edge in her voice. I mean it. So, you're all right with that, are you? Yes, I am. So, what do you want from me? Let me explain. The woman self-consciously drew the edges of her kimono together over her lap, as if fearful she might be assaulted in this room alone with a man. Though, for Hanyo's part, nothing about her invited any interest. Now, my job involves lending books out in a small library. There's no point you asking me which one. After all, there are as many libraries in Tokyo as there are police stations. Anyway, as a single woman with time on my hands, I like to buy various evening newspapers on the way home from work. Once I'm home, I immerse myself in reading the advice columns, classified ads, job vacancies, exchange columns, and the like. At first, I was an avid member of a pen pal club, and I even went so far as to set up a mailbox address in order to exchange letters. But I was aware that meeting anyone in the flesh would end in disaster, so I just led them on a bit, and then abruptly cut the correspondence. What do you mean meeting anyone would end in disaster? Hanyo's question was cruel. Everybody has their own fantasies, the woman replied irritably, avoiding his eyes. You shouldn't try to humiliate people like that. I'm in the middle of telling you my story. In any case, the pen pal thing bored me after a bit, and I began to seek out other ways of keeping myself entertained. But they were very hard to come by. That's exactly why I put out my Life for Sale ad. Must you interrupt? Let me finish my story. Around February this year, 10 months ago, I guess, I happened to catch sight of a notice in one of the newspapers. Looking to buy the illustrated book of Japanese beetles, published 1927 by Gentaro Yamawaki. Will pay 200,000 yen. Must be an unabridged edition. Contact, mailbox 2778, Central Post Office. Now that is not a bad price at all to be offering. The market in second-hand books seems to have taken off in recent years, and the price must have meant it was a rare volume. The person who had posted the notice had probably made inquiries at second-hand bookshops with no success, and then decided to advertise in the newspaper. My instinct was right, it turns out. It seems I have a pretty good nose for business. Now, at the end of each fiscal year, a major tidy-up takes place in my library. We take out all the volumes in the stacks, give them a good dusting, and put them back in the correct order. It's quite a job. Among several hundred volumes, of which half are hidden away under the natural science classification. I noticed last year that there were as many as 10 books on entomology. In the fields of medicine and physics, recent inventions and discoveries leading to new drugs and other treatments mean that certain books become totally redundant. But not so in entomology, as I was well aware. Brushing away the dust, I opened up each volume and peeped inside. And then I came across the volume by Gentaro Yamawaki entitled The Illustrated Book of Japanese Beetles and published by Uendo in 1927. I immediately recalled the newspaper notice I'd seen about the book, and an evil thought, the first such thought during my long years at the library, took root. Everything the woman went on to say indicated that, until that moment, she had lived a perfectly crime-free life. But while her fantasies had until then remained half-baked, the prospect of 200,000 yen in cash meant that somewhere deep in her heart there had suddenly crackled into life a desire for clothes and luxury goods that would allow her to look other women in the eye. Before she knew it, she had concealed the illustrated book of Japanese beetles in a piece of waste paper she happened to have at hand. She continued with the reorganization as if nothing was amiss. Then, telling her colleague she was going to throw something away, she left the room with the waste paper, the book hidden inside. She secretly took out the book and concealed it in a friend's room for the time being. Her plan was that, even if this book stamped with the library mark happened to turn up somewhere in the future, she had the ready-made alibi that she had accidentally thrown it away with the waste paper. Anyway, that evening, back at her apartment, she opened the book, her heart racing, as if she were opening some scandalous publication. The smell of dust arose from between the pages. As she had suspected, it was the kind of rare book that curiosity seekers would relish. It was hard to tell whether it had been written for pure pleasure or as a work of art in its own right. Considering how old the printing was, the tricolour illustrations were extremely beautiful. There were dazzling images of beetles in their various stages, showing the different markings on their backs, like a colour advertisement for fashion accessories. In each illustration, the beetle had a number and a scientific name, as well as a description of its appearance and habitat. But it was the chapter titles that struck her as most curious. They did not conform to any scientific system of classification she had seen before. The table of contents was as follows. Type 1, sensual genus, aphrodisiac order, stimulatory order. Type 2, soporific genus. Type 3, homicidal genus. Inevitably, as a spinster, she felt obliged to skip the first chapter entirely, though of course she was dying to read it, and gave her undivided attention to the two that followed. Some unknown person, she noted, had covered the third chapter. Type 3, homicidal genus, with a mass of untidy red circles and lines. One section that stood out was Variety of Scarab Beetle, Anthipna pectinata, on page 132. The illustration showed a rather ordinary-looking small brown beetle with almost no neck linking its head and thorax. A pair of antlers grew out of its armoured head, which was also covered in brush-like protrusions. The insect looked vaguely familiar. The description was as follows. Native to Tokyo region, Honshu. Found around rose, harlequin glorybower, Clerodendrum trichotomum, and a great variety of other flowers. A relatively easy beetle to come by, its soporific properties are surprisingly little known. Even less well known is the fact that it can be used to potentially lethal effect, homicide under the guise of suicide. This is done by drying the beetle and grinding it into a powder, then mixing it with the hypnotic sedative bromovalerilurea. Once administered to the recipient, this potion allows for the conveyance of commands to the brain while the person is asleep and facilitates a wide range of suicidal methods. Here the description ended. But this was all she needed to see into the criminal intentions of the person who had placed the notice in the newspaper in search of the book. With a razor blade, she scraped away the library ownership stamp on the book's inside cover and title page. She then wrote a message out on a postcard, which she addressed to the mailbox number given at the bottom of the notice, and posted it. "I have unabridged edition in my possession. If still required, can supply according to stipulated conditions for immediate payment on delivery. Please advise appropriate time and place. Sundays best if possible." To this she appended her own mailbox number. Just 4 days later, a reply arrived. The date specified in the letter was the following Sunday, which was fine for her. But the location was a bit of a walk from Fujisawa Station in Chigasaki. A map was enclosed, showing the address of a house that was evidently a holiday villa belonging to a family named Nakajima. Only one thing gave her pause. Quite a few of the characters in the letter were written incorrectly, in a strangely childish hand. There was even a mistake in her name. Something doesn't seem quite right, she thought. That Sunday, on a bright, sunny spring afternoon, and with a cold breeze blowing, she walked from Fujisawa Station in the direction of the sea, following the directions given on the map. She left the main road and turned off into a side street. The tarmac immediately gave way to an unpaved sandy track. The stone walls of rows of holiday villas were almost completely obscured by sand dunes. Yellow butterflies fluttered here and there. There was not a single sign of human activity. Of course, these days, lots of commuters who work in Tokyo have houses in places like this. But this little spot seemed every inch the long-standing holiday home enclave, and it was deathly silent. She passed through an old gate that bore the Nakajima nameplate to find a long sandy path leading to the house. A Western-style home surrounded by pines came into view. The large garden was in an unkempt state, and the damp sea wind blew hard and strong through it. She pressed the bell. To her surprise, a fat, ruddy-faced foreigner wearing a loud plaid sports jacket came to the door. The foreigner's level of Japanese was excellent, to such a degree that it rather unsettled her. "Thank you for your letter. We've been waiting for you to visit. Please, come on through." He led her into a room where there was another foreigner, this one as skinny as a stick insect. He got up from his chair and greeted her courteously. She had come fully prepared to make her escape if things got nasty. The set of heavy American-style rattan chairs placed directly on the tatami mats of this large, uncarpeted room strongly suggested that this was a temporary residence. There was no other furniture of note, though a colour TV had been placed in the alcove, traditionally used for ornaments. It was not switched on, and the television screen brought to mind the bluish-black surface gleam of a swamp. The paper sliding doors had been left open, and along one side of the corridor, its floor all sandy, were some ill-fitting glass doors that rattled endlessly in the wind. She noticed they were unlocked, and felt confident she could get away through any number of open doors. The thin man offered her alcohol, which she declined, so a glass of lemonade was placed before her instead. The thought that they might slip her a sleeping potion before their business was concluded so worried her that she did not touch it despite being parched. The fat foreigner who was fluent in Japanese offered her a chair, but he said nothing further. No mention was made of the illustrated Beetle book. She placed on her lap the shopping bag that held it and patted it ostentatiously. Still no response. The two men continued to whisper in English, ignoring her. She did not understand a word of what they were saying, but, judging from their expressions, they seemed to be discussing something serious. Her impatience grew. Just then the doorbell rang. "Oh, maybe, Henry." The fat foreigner had suddenly switched to English as he hurried to the door. An elderly foreign man, quite dapper, dressed for the outdoors, entered, preceded by a dachshund with lank ears. It's for oily-looking, rather like a seal. From the attitude of the other two men, it was clear that this man was their boss. The pair introduced him to her in a very deferential manner. She was not at all pleased when the dog proceeded to give itself a good shake. The man appeared to speak no Japanese and offered a few quick pleasantries in English. The fat foreigner acted as interpreter. Henry expresses his thanks that you kindly came as agreed, and he offers you his deepest respects. That's going a bit far, she thought to herself. But he continued, I see you brought the book. Finally, he had broached it. She felt relieved. She took the book out of the bag. The money, please. The monnaie. Don't forget. She had expected the fat foreigner to interpret, but this was ignored. The thought that they might get something out of her for nothing caused her throat to tighten. The elderly foreigner flicked through the book's pages numerous times. The glow on his face indicated satisfaction. What a relief, said the fat man. All the copies of this book we've obtained so far have only been about 30 pages long, with whole sections missing. You will know that the Japanese police used to censor passages in books at the time that this was published. This is the first unabridged version we have seen, and, as you can observe, Henry is delighted. He was checking it through before he paid you the cash. Here is the 200,000 yen. Go ahead. Please confirm the amount. Dimples formed in the fat man's cheeks, shiny white like enamel, as he handed over the money. The dog came up to sniff the bills. She was relieved to count out 20 crisp 10,000 yen bills, and, seeing no reason to stay any longer, rose from her chair with the intention of taking her leave there and then. Oh, so you're leaving? The fat man said. The thin man also stood up to bar her way. Since you've been so kind as to come all this way, won't you at least share something to eat before you depart? I'd rather not. Now that she was about to take her leave, she felt she didn't have to mince words. She could see herself getting into some frightening scenario otherwise. The fat man suddenly leant over and whispered in her ear, What about another 500,000? Hey? She stood there wondering if she'd heard correctly. Hanio's curiosity was piqued. Nothing about this woman drew him to her as a member of the opposite sex, but her tale thoroughly engrossed him. Hey, that is quite an adventure. So did you manage to come away with that extra money? The money didn't interest me. I managed somehow to slip out of their clutches and make my way home. Though no one seemed actually to be tailing me, I ran so fast I was soaked through with perspiration by the time I arrived at the station. And did you ever go back? Well, actually. So you did receive another call? No, I was just intrigued to know what had happened next. So one Sunday in July, when the weather was sunny and I had some time on my hands, I went back to check. There was clearly someone in, so I rang the bell, but this time a Japanese housewife came to the door. I was surprised and asked what had happened to Henry. She told me she'd rented the place to a foreigner for a brief 2 or 3 weeks in the spring, but she had no idea of what had become of him afterward. She was quite unfriendly, so I came straight back home. Well, this is all very interesting, but what has it got to do with me? I'm just getting to that part. She bummed a cigarette off him and lit it. There was nothing flirtatious in her action. In fact, she was like an old woman in a lottery booth who persuades someone to buy one of her tickets and then has the effrontery to ask that same customer for a smoke. After that, I didn't hear a thing. I kept my mailbox as before, but no one contacted me. And then I saw your life for sale ad, and that set me thinking. It occurred to me that the 500,000 yen might very well have been an inducement for me to act as their guinea pig in an experiment. It made a lot of sense. I thought then that if they saw your ad, they would be certain to communicate with you. But I've had no such contact. And anyway, don't you think foreign crooks would have taken themselves straight off to Hong Kong or Singapore? Only if they were in the ACS, she said. What? Hanyo was dumbfounded. So this woman knew about the ACS too. That Asian mobster had described the ACS as a mere fiction, the stuff of thriller mangas. But Hanyo started to wonder whether the organization was in fact real and had something to do with Ruriko's death. Having heard what the woman in front of him had to say, he now felt that everything was being woven together into a single tapestry. Hanyo started to suspect that his willingness to sell his own life had turned him into an ACS pawn. But there was no way this woman was part of the ACS. Surely no one who was affiliated with such a masterly organization would mention it so carelessly. She had simply given an honest report of her meeting with the foreigners in Chigasaki. There was nothing more to it than that. "So, what is the ACS?" he asked. "You mean you don't know?" The Asia Confidential Service is a secret organization said to be involved in narcotic drug smuggling. "How do you know about it?" "A foreigner who turned out to be a drug dealer used to be a visitor to the library. He came in every day, and we thought to ourselves, 'Wow, he studies hard.' But he was also sociable and handsome. I heard it said that he was an assistant professor at C University in Los Angeles. Every day he seemed to come in to do his research into Japanese history, so we all assumed he was a renowned specialist in his field. Pretty soon, I started to notice that a Japanese man, clearly unemployed, had become a frequent occupant of the seat next to the foreigner. The two of them seemed to strike up quite a friendship, and the Japanese man began to borrow book after book, all on the subject of Japanese history. It got to a point where a young female colleague of mine remarked to me, "What a funny state of affairs. He's Japanese, and yet he's being taught about Japanese history by that foreigner, who clearly has a much deeper knowledge than he does." It wasn't long before the foreigner became friendly with the girl at the reception desk, and the subject came up of going out to a nearby coffee shop. But unfortunately for the girl, the foreigner seemed keen to observe propriety, and he insisted that she choose another friend to accompany them. The girl was pretty miffed when he asked us both out. I wasn't particularly bothered, but I went along for the meal. It must have been May last year. I remember the evening vividly. The library had just closed, and the bright afternoon sunshine was all around us as we walked along the avenue of beautiful trees that leads from the library to the main road. We decided to take him to one of our regular coffee shops, and all three of us felt buoyed up by a mixture of pleasure and competitiveness. So we sat down and started a conversation about various things. Of course, his Japanese was quite good, and he certainly had the gift of the gab. Sitting here with two beauties, drinking this foreign-made tea, which after all was imported into Japan by early European traders, I feel just like a Tokugawa shogun must have felt, sitting with his harem of ladies in the inner sanctum of Edo Castle. We all laughed merrily. If you took it the wrong way, it might have seemed rather crude, but coming from Mr. Dodwell, that was his name, well, it was charming. His Japanese wasn't perfect, if anything rather lacking in finesse, and there was something about him that was a bit too glib. He reminded me of a machine that is rather too well oiled. In the course of our conversation, I remember, he suddenly paused and then asked quite amiably, "I wonder, have either of you heard of the ACS? Is it the name of a TV station?" I haven't heard of any such channel in Japan. Perhaps an American TV station?" my friend asked. "Or maybe the name of a company that makes TVs. I'd say it was an international agricultural cooperative organization. Agriculture Cooperative System, something like that." She was just showing off what little education she had, so I glared right at her. He listened, smiling broadly. "You're getting warmer with that last answer. It does appear to be an international organization, a secret one by the name of the Asia Confidential Service. It's a little scary, actually, and it's closer than you'd think." We listened to him intently, slightly disturbed now. Mr. Dodwell continued, "You've seen the Japanese guy who sits next to me in the library all the time, asking me questions about history. You rarely get that kind of pest in a library, and I've found it a real pain. To top it all, his questions have all been utterly inane. One day he asked me, completely out of the blue, how many children did the 14th century samurai Masashige Kusunoki have? I hadn't the foggiest, so I just pretended I knew the answer and told him 10, whereupon his face suddenly lit up. Knowing what I know now, I'm pretty sure that my reply may just happen to have been the correct reply to some sort of secret password. Even then, he didn't come clean, and he didn't let down his guard. But the day before yesterday, he suddenly informed me he had decided that I wasn't a member of the ACS after all. I didn't know what he was on about. I asked what the ACS was. He looked a bit smug when he replied, "Asia Confidential Service." I'm so relieved. I mistook you for someone else and came within an inch of killing you. And then he took his leave. The thought that I almost got it in the neck scared the living daylights out of me. To think I'd been under suspicion of being a member of the organization. Wow, that's scary. You should have informed the police immediately. We both chimed in. Well, sometimes stirring the pot can cause even more trouble. Mr. Dodwell spoke with a quiet tension in his voice. Mr. Dodwell never came to the library again, but I never forgot the name ACS. At this point, Hanio broke in. So, maybe Dodwell, if that was his real name, actually was the ACS member. But if that was the case, why would he come out and mention it? Asked the woman. Maybe he thought his cover in the library was blown, and he was trying to get a handle on the situation by sounding you out. Who knows? The woman was thinking about something else. Okay, to return to the main issue. Yes, the reason I came to buy your life. Seeing as you still haven't heard anything from that foreigner Henry, whom I met previously, we can assume that the offer of 500,000, the one he made to me that time I was about to leave, still stands. The moment I saw your ad, I knew you were the right person to test that scarab beetle drug on. A referral fee of 100,000 yen is all I need for myself. So could I interest you in selling me your life for a fee of 400,000? I would assume responsibility for sending that whole amount to your next of kin, and, to put your mind at rest, I would do it before your death. Does that sound like a deal? I don't have any next of kin, in which case, what should I do with the money? Why don't you use it to buy some large animal, a crocodile, a gorilla, something like that, to lavish your attention on? Probably the best thing for you would be to give up on marriage completely and spend the rest of your life with whichever of those animals you choose. I don't believe any other partner would make you happier. But don't even think of making handbags out of it. All you have to do is feed the creature every day, exercise it, and put your heart and soul into raising it. And each time you look into its eyes, you'll be reminded of me. You're a very odd person. No, you're the odd one. The woman drafted a letter to Henry, which she sent to his mailbox address via special delivery. Her message was brief. Will take part in pharmaceutical test for 500,000 yen. Have my own subject. The response was immediate, with a designated date and location for the test, January the 3rd in the Shibura Warehouse district of Tokyo. Hanyu and the woman arranged to meet beforehand, and together they made their way to the deserted district under a cold sliver of moon that looked as if it was being tossed about by the wind in the wintry night. They knocked on the designated door. On the 5th knock, it swung open. They followed a staircase down through numerous twists and turns to a cold metal door. As they pushed it open, a blast of thick, warm air hit them in the face. They entered a well-heated, Western-style room, quite large and laid with a red carpet. 2 large square windows, set side by side, gave onto a polluted seabed scene. Not a single fish swam in the water, which was filled with all kinds of accumulated debris and other odds and ends. Close to one window floated what might have been the small, whitish corpse of a fish, but it looked more like a human fetus, and Hanyo hurriedly averted his eyes. The room itself was comfortably set out. Red electric lighting gave the impression of artificial logs flickering in the fireplace. An electric fire no doubt avoided the need for a vent. 3 foreigners were there waiting for them. The aging foreigner with a dachshund on a lead had to be Henry. The woman was the first to break the ice. "You remember you asked me whether I needed 500,000 yen. "Yes," one of the 2 younger foreigners replied in Japanese. "I assumed you were asking if I was willing to become a guinea pig for the drug." "Your assumption was correct. I've brought this man along to be the guinea pig for me. I've already bought his life from him, so give me the 500,000 now, if you please." This caught the foreigner off guard, and he addressed Henry in English. A whispered discussion between the 3 men ensued. "So, are you really content with the possibility that you may die?" said the first foreigner. "Yes," Hanyo replied calmly. "And what are you looking so astonished for? You all know, I'm sure, that human life is quite meaningless and people are just puppets anyway. What's the big deal? You have just the right attitude. Ever since we got hold of that book, we've collected as many scarab beetles as we could lay our hands on, mixing them with bromovaleriluria to make the drug. We've tried it out on a couple of subjects and, as it says in the book, they become susceptible to our instructions. But we haven't yet got to the point of persuading someone to commit suicide. So we're still not sure whether the instinct for life will stop someone going through with it when the crunch comes. But now that we have someone like you who's willing to die, we can finally carry out the test." "Well, hand over the 500,000 first," repeated the woman. Henry instructed one of the men to bring him a stash of banknotes. He carefully counted out 50 10,000 yen bills and handed the cash over to the librarian. The woman removed 10 of the bills, putting them in her handbag, and gave the rest to Hanyo. A pistol lay on top of a table nearby. "It's loaded. The safety catch is off. If you point it toward you and pull the trigger, it's game over," one of the men said. Hanyo sat down in an armchair next to the table and swallowed the powdered drug that was handed him, washing it down with some water. Nothing unusual was happening. He had no premonition of how drastically his whole world was going to change. The powdered remains of some lazy, good-for-nothing beetle, whose only mission in its unremarkable life was to fly from flower to flower, sticking its dirty little nose deep into pollen until it choked, had now entered his body. But this offered no clue to the manner in which his world was about to turn into a flower garden. The old spinster's hard face suddenly loomed up in front of him. He got an eyeful of every detail, every wrinkle beneath her eyes, every pore on the rough skin of her cheeks, every loose strand of her hair, all of it calling out like an urgent clangor of bells. "I love you. I love you. I love you." The words were deafeningly loud. Hanyo wanted to cover his ears. Once the world has been transformed into something meaningful, some feel they can die without regret. Others feel that they exist in a world without meaning. So, what's the point of living? But where do these 2 sets of feelings converge? For Hanyo, both paths led to the same thing: death. Before long, his surroundings turned viscous and began to gyrate. He watched as the wallpaper bulged, billowing out as if blown by the wind. Flocks of what looked like yellow birds fluttered around him. They made him dizzy. The sound of music reached him from somewhere. This music evoked the vision of a green forest swaying like seaweed, which then changed into flowers. They looked like wisteria, drooping from branch after branch, with countless wild horses galloping in circles below. He was not sure why this particular fantasy should have arisen, but he sensed that his everyday world, the world of those newspapers filled with cockroach-shaped letters, was doing its very best to transform itself into something marvelous. But maybe doing its best was a little over the top, Hanyo reflected. A meaningless world doing its best? What a pathetic idea. He did not feel nauseous, but neither did he seem to be in a trance. Suddenly, his surroundings underwent another transformation. Numerous gigantic needles sprang up around his body. These needles glittered in the light, and then, cactus-like, flowers unfolded from the needle points. The flowers were red and yellow and white. To Hanyo's eyes, the blossoms appeared tawdry. The needles then turned into television antennae, and he watched as green plastic wastebaskets floated in the air inside the room, filling the entire space as if they were giant advertising blimps. It's all so banal. The whole world is a waste of time. Hanyo was not impressed. How are you feeling? Do you think you could die now? A voice reached him. Absolutely. His body suddenly appeared to be floating. Until then, he had felt bound to the chair, but now his limbs seemed free to move. Yet he was surprised what a carefree thrill he experienced whenever he moved his limbs in accordance with someone else's instructions. He never imagined it would be like this. All right, let's go with it. Follow my instructions. I'll take it nice and slow. Thank you. Stretch your right hand out. Like this? Like that. Exactly. This was all going on inside Hanyo's own head, so his words ought to have been inaudible even to himself. Yet there the other man was, giving instructions in response to what Hanyo said. Now, you should be able to reach the hard black object on top of the table with your fingers. Take it firmly in your grasp. There we go. Don't touch the trigger yet. Now, bring it gently up to your head. Easy now. Easy. Relax your shoulders. Better? Press the muzzle against your temple. It probably feels a bit cold. Rather nice, yes? Gives you a fresh feeling, doesn't it? A feeling of relief, just like one of those cooling pads for your forehead when you have a fever. Now, nice and gently, place your forefinger on the trigger. Hanyo held the gun muzzle to his temple, finger on trigger. At that moment, he was aware that someone had lunged toward him. The gun was snatched away, and there was an almighty bang right next to him. A dog began to yelp, an incessant clamour that resounded painfully in his ears. The shock seemed to break the drug's effect. Giving his head a shake, he rose to his feet. Everything in the room came into remarkably sharp focus. The woman was slumped in a twisted heap at his feet, blood pouring from her forehead. The fat man with the ruddy face, the man who looked like a skinny stick insect, Henry the elegant gentleman, all three stood, stunned, over her corpse. Holding a hand to his groggy head, Hanyo craned his neck to get a good look at her dead body. The woman held the gun in her right hand. "What happened?" Hanyo asked the florid foreigner. "She died," the man answered vacantly, breaking his silence in Japanese. "Why?" "She must have loved you to bits. That's the only logical explanation, isn't it? And so she chose to die in your place. But if the thought of watching you die was so unbearable to her, why not just take the gun out of your hand? Why did she have to kill herself?" Hanyo's thoughts were all over the place, but he did his best to remain focused. It was obvious why she had killed herself. She had become infatuated with him, but, not believing that she would be loved in return, she took her own life. There could be no other explanation. "It's suicide, no question about it," the foreigner continued. "We don't have anything to worry about." The thought of how they were going to sort things out afterward was the last thing Hanyo had been thinking about. So she had taken a shine to him. What a tiresome thought. Even more tiresome was that she had to be such an ugly woman, who had then chosen to do away with herself. Extraordinary. There were no two ways about it. Both times he had tried selling his life to others, but it was they who had come to a sticky end. Hanyo watched the foreigners coolly, wondering what course they would choose. Perhaps they might finish him off there and then. The three of them huddled together, conversing in whispers. while the dachshund continued to growl at the dead body. The sight of blood seemed to have stirred up something savage in this otherwise overly domesticated creature. The blood oozed stealthily from under the corpse onto the surrounding floor, as if using the confusion of the moment to make its escape. The woman's gaping mouth appeared as a dark cavity that presented a secret route to the end of the world. Her eyes were slightly open, with a straggle of hair caught across one of them. "Come to think of it, this is the first time I've ever got a good view of a dead person," said Hanyo to himself. "I never saw even my mother and father's bodies up this close. A dead body reminds me a bit of a bottle of whiskey. If you drop the bottle and it cracks, what's inside pours out. It's only natural." The leaden sea moved restlessly on the other side of the windows. The foreigners were still deep in conversation. Hanyo had a poor grasp of English, but his ears caught words to do with flight numbers, airlines, and airplanes. One of the men took the 10,000 yen bills from the woman's handbag, wrapping his hand in a handkerchief before doing so. He pressed the money into Hanyo's hand, saying, "Here's some hush money, if you blab a word." He made a cutting sign across his throat and uttered a sound that curdled the blood. They took him to their car and dropped him off at Hamamatsucho Station. All three remained silent, as if willfully ignoring him. As the car drove off, Hanyo gave a brief wave and immediately turned his back. He could have been taking leave of a few friends after a picnic. After purchasing a train ticket, he made his way up the stairs. His head began to play tricks on him again. The dreary concrete steps seemed to go on forever. He tried to concentrate hard on climbing them, but however far he went, he never seemed to reach the platform. As he continued, the steps seemed to increase in number. He was aware that somewhere up above him could be heard the shrill sound of guards' whistles, departing trains, and large crowds alighting, but it all seemed a long way away from the steps he was climbing. He thought of himself as already dead. Morality, emotions, everything, all meaningless. He was completely free. And yet his mind remained weighed down with the love of that woman who had just died. Weren't other people supposed to be nothing more than cockroaches to him? Just when the steps began to resemble an interminable waterfall gushing down over him, he suddenly emerged onto the station platform. A train had arrived. Hanyo boarded, thoroughly exhausted. Inside the carriage, it was preternaturally bright and completely deserted. The plastic laminated hanging straps swayed uniformly in the air. He took hold of one. Actually, it was more accurate to say that a white strap took hold of him. Back at the apartment, he waited anxiously to see how things would play out. Feeling exhausted, he flipped the card on his door to read "Sold." How strange that his exhaustion meant there would have to be a stay of execution. Even flirting with the notion of death seemed to require energy. No article appeared in the newspaper, either the next day or the day after that, regarding the discovery of the body of a woman who had committed suicide in some strange, undersea den. No doubt her corpse was still there, rotting away. Gradually, Hanyo's everyday feelings returned to him. The very same feelings he had experienced since his botched suicide. That everything was unreal and dishonest. The world he inhabited lacked all sadness or joy. Nothing was clearly defined in it. A kind of meaninglessness infused his life both day and night, like the soft glow from indirect light. That woman, she didn't exist. That secret underwater room, all that crazy stuff never happened. This is what he decided to believe. Having put his mind at rest, he decided to go into town. The festivities for the New Year were still going on. It felt odd not to have embraced a woman for such a long time. As he walked through Shinjuku, his attention was caught by the backside of a girl entering a shop where a sale was on. It was warm, but the fact that she wore no coat set her apart even so. Covered by a slightly faded green plaid skirt, Her bottom in the winter sunlight seemed crammed with the very essence of life, as voluptuous as any painted by Renoir. She exuded the kind of glossy freshness one might find in a brand new tube of toothpaste just taken from its box, with its promise of a crisp morning. His eyes firmly on the girl's rear, Hanio entered the shop without a moment's hesitation. The young woman stopped in front of some sweaters that were part of the clearance sale. The variously coloured garments lay in a jumbled heap inside what looked like a sandbox. Hanio observed the girl's profile as she threw herself into choosing a sweater. She was pursing her lips. The tawdry silver pineapple earrings that she wore, even though it was still daytime, suggested she made her living in a third-rate bar. However, from the side, her features were attractive, and he found the curve of her nose exquisite. Women with drooping noses made Hanio sick of life, but this nose was shaped in a way that revived the spirits. "Would you like to go to a cafe?" Hanio asked artlessly, almost as if it was too much effort. "Wait a moment. I'm looking at this right now," the young woman answered coolly, without so much as a look at him. She reached deep into the pile and pulled out a sweater. Spreading the arms of the garment wide so that it took on the appearance of a large black bat, she appraised it. Her pursed lips suggested she was not particularly impressed. A label with a garish red and gold company logo dangled from the sweater's torso like a fancy strip of paper you might see at the Summer Star Festival. "It's not a bad price," she said out loud. She then turned to Hanio for the first time. "What do you think? Does it suit me?" She held it up to her chest for him to see. Hanio was surprised by her easy tone. It was as if she were conversing with a man she had been living with for 10 years. At the same time, he noticed how the sweater, which had resembled a lifeless bat, swelled out when placed across her chest and clung there wantonly. "Not bad," said Hanio. "Okay, I'll buy it. I won't be a minute." The young woman went to the cashier. If she had asked him to buy such a cheap garment for her, it would have made him feel like a husband buying some gift to placate his wife. Hanio enjoyed watching her from behind as she peered into her purse and made her purchase. They found a nearby coffee shop and went inside. "The name is Machiko. I assume you want to sleep with me?" she said. "I'm still deciding." "Oh, you're awful! How spiteful you are!" she said with a great gust of laughter. Everything went just as he'd hoped it would. Machiko did not have to go in to work until 7 in the evening, so he went with her to her sparsely furnished apartment a few blocks away. Machiko yawned and undid the hooks on the side of her skirt. "I never feel the cold," she said. "Well, you weren't wearing a coat, so I knew you had to be hot." "Oh, yeah. You're a cocky one, aren't you? I know your sort," she said. Her body smelled so strongly of dry grass from the countryside that Hanio worried afterward that he might have some of it stuck in his suit. After sharing a light meal in a snack bar, he saw her off to work. They went their separate ways, and he sat through half a Yakuza gangster film. When he got back to his apartment, it was just after 8. As he stepped up to open the door, he almost tripped over something. Someone was crouched down there in the dark. "Hey, who are you?" A diminutive, thin boy in a school uniform stood up without replying. His small, dark face resembled a rodent's. "Are you really sold?" The question was the last thing Hanio expected, and for a moment he couldn't take it in. "Eh?" he asked back. "Has your life really been sold?" There was an increasing stridency to his tone. "It's as it says on the card. Not true. You're clearly alive and well, aren't you? If you actually were sold, you'd have to be dead." "Not necessarily. Anyway, come in." For some reason, Hanio had already taken a shine to the boy. He ushered him inside. He then switched on the light and lit the stove. Meanwhile, the boy looked around, making sniffling sounds like young people do. Without sitting down, he said, "Very strange. You don't look like you've got money problems, so how come you want to sell your life? Don't ask things that don't concern you. After all, everybody has their own reasons. Hanyo offered him a chair. The boy made a big show of flopping himself down. Ah, I'm exhausted. I was waiting for 2 whole hours. I'm already sold, so what else would you expect? I saw what you had written on the other side of the card. I'm sure you just turn it over when you want to take a break. Even I can tell that much. That's very sharp of you. So, does a kid like you have the money to buy my life? This should do it. The boy undid the gold buttons of his school jacket, casually pulled out a bundle of 10,000 yen bills from his inside pocket as if he were producing a travel pass, and held them under Hanyo's nose. It had to be about 200,000 yen. How did you get hold of that? Don't worry, I didn't steal it. I sold one of the Tsuguharu Fujita sketches in my family's possession. I got a pittance for it, but I had no choice. It was an emergency. The way this pitiful youth with his rodent-like features spoke made it abundantly clear he was from a well-heeled, respectable family. Now that's a surprise. I stand corrected. So what do you intend to do with my life once you've bought it? I'm a son with a powerful sense of filial duty. Very admirable. My dad died some years ago, and my mother raised me, her only child, all on her own. On top of that, Mother has had her own poor health to contend with. It's all been so sad. You mean, for your mother? That's right. So, what do you want of me? To put it in a nutshell, I want you to look after my mother. You want me to nurse her? She's ill, but she'll recover right away with care from you. But why is it necessary for me to sell my life? Let me explain, will you? The boy stuck out a beautiful red tongue and licked his lower lip. The sad fact is, when Dad died, Mother became sexually frustrated. At first, she held herself back out of consideration for me, but it wasn't long before she just couldn't resist any more. It happens, Hanyo interjected. He felt slightly bored. This callow little school kid clearly had some excessively grand illusions of what life was all about. He was at that age where they construct strange and tawdry dramas in their heads, convinced they know all there is to know. But there was something about the boy that was rather precocious. You see it a lot in young people these days. Something dry and tasteless, like the stalk of an overgrown blade of grass. That's how it seemed to Hanyo. He's come to buy my life out of a desperate need to act like a grown-up, Hanyo thought. He found it hard to take him seriously. Then Mother got herself a boyfriend. But the guy didn't stay around for long. She found another one, and he escaped too. There must have been 12 or 13 of them altogether. After being with her, they all turned white as a sheet and hightailed out of there. And then, 2 or 3 months ago, she was dumped by a man she was head over heels about, and she found herself unable even to get out of bed. She went down with chronic anemia. Can you guess why? Hanyo replied, not particularly concerned. The boy's eyes sparkled as he came to the point. Can't you tell? My mother is a very unusual sort of person. You see, she's a vampire. What did the boy mean? How could his mother be a vampire? Did such things as vampires really exist in this day and age? But the boy offered no further explanation. Instead, he punctiliously produced a printed receipt with clear instructions. I've entered 230,000 yen here, with an additional note. Strictly advance payment only. Reimbursement due in case of buyer dissatisfaction. Sign here, please. He handed over the receipt. I'm a bit tired today, the boy announced after taking back the receipt, now signed. I need to go to bed. I'll come for you tomorrow at 8 p.m. I suggest you have an early dinner. Make sure all your personal arrangements are in order before leaving. After all, you might not return alive. And even if you do make it home in one piece, you'll be away for about 10 days. So, be prepared. Alone, Hanyo recalled the name at the top of the receipt he'd been asked to sign, Kaoru Inoue. Somehow, death seemed more likely this time round. Hanyo thought it best to get a good night's sleep himself. The next evening, at 8 o'clock precisely, there was a knock at the door. It was Kaoru come to fetch him. Like the day before, he was wearing his school uniform. The boy seemed surprised at Hanyo's cheerfulness. As they left the apartment, Kaoru tried to ascertain whether Hanyo knew what he was letting himself in for. "Do you really hold your life so cheaply?" "Yes." "What did you do with the money I gave you yesterday?" "I put it in the drawer." "You didn't deposit it in the bank." "What would be the point of that? If somebody finds it after I'm dead, all that will happen is my landlord will pocket it. Surely you get what I mean. You can value my life at 200 or 300,000 yen. It's all the same to me. Money only makes the world go round when you're alive." The two left the apartment and started walking. "Let's get a cab." The boy seemed in a buoyant mood as he hailed a taxi. Once the driver had received instructions to go to Ogikubo, it was Hanyo's turn to ask a question. "You seem in remarkably good spirits. Does it make you happy that I'm about to die?" The driver's startled eyes flashed up in the rear-view mirror. "Of course not. I'm just thrilled to be able to do something positive for Mother." It dawned on Hanyo that the boy viewed everything through the lens of his fantastical world. But his two previous adventures had both ended in tragedy, so he was relaxed about taking part in an absurd comedy this time. The taxi stopped outside a magnificently gated house tucked away in a dark residential street. Since this was where the boy got out, Hanyo assumed it was the place, but Kaoru kept on walking. After turning left and walking for 2 or 3 more blocks, he used his key to unlock the door of a house much like the earlier one. He looked up at Hanyo through the darkness and smiled sweetly. No lights seemed to be on in the house, but the boy continued to unlock yet more doors until Hanyo found himself in a well-lit reception room. The musty room that met Hanyo's eyes in the light of the floor lamps was an elegant one, arranged in a traditional style and with a real fireplace. A cracked Louis XIV mirror hung above the mantelpiece. Below it, a gold-coloured antique clock with supporting cherubs on either side. Kaoru gave a sneeze and silently set about getting the fire going. "Are you and your mother the only ones living here?" "Of course." "What do you do for meals?" "These domestic questions are really boring. I see to the cooking myself, and I ensure my patient gets properly fed as well." With the fire flaring up beautifully, the boy picked out a bottle of fine brandy from a corner cabinet. Holding 2 brandy glasses by their narrow stems, he skillfully warmed them in the flames of the hearth and then held out one to Hanyo. "What about your mother?" "Oh, she'll be another 30 minutes or so. We have this arrangement. Whenever anyone enters the front door, a bell rings by her bedside. After that, it takes her a while to get out of bed and put on her makeup and clothes. So it'll be 30 minutes minimum before she appears. Mother has taken rather a shine to you, and she's a bit on edge. You take an excellent photo." "My photo? How did you get hold of one?" Hanyo asked in surprise. "Didn't you notice? I took one yesterday evening." The boy showed him a small camera, roughly the size of a matchbox, poking out from his jacket pocket. He smiled teasingly. "Well, I didn't see that one coming." Hanyo rolled the brandy about in his glass and then sipped it. Its fragrance encouraged him to imagine that tonight's encounter might contain something sweet. Kaoru gazed at this adult doing what adults always do, enjoying a relaxed drink after his meal, and fiddled with the buttons on his jacket. Suddenly, he sprang to his feet. "Ah, I forgot. I have some homework to do tonight, so I will leave you now. Please be nice to Mother. By the way, I know an undertaker who's not at all expensive, so you need have no worries in that regard." "Hey, wait a minute," Hanyo said. But the boy had disappeared. Alone, Hanyo could only kill time by looking around the room. Why was he always in this situation, waiting for something to happen? This must be what living was all about. While he was working at Tokyo Ad, it had actually been more a kind of death. A daily grind in an overlit, ridiculously modern office where everyone wore the latest suits and never got their hands dirty with proper work. Most likely, those colleagues would think it oddly contradictory now to discover Hanyo, who had determined to die, sipping brandy and looking forward to the future, even though his own death featured prominently in it. He cast his eyes idly around the room. A pen and ink fox-hunting drawing, a portrait of a sallow-looking woman. His gaze alighted on a packet peeking out from the corner of a picture frame. People often tuck secret stashes of money in such spots, but surely, he thought, no one would hide money in a reception room. It was a long wait, and Hanyo's curiosity gradually got the better of him. Finally giving in to it, he went up to the picture and removed the packet. Its coating of dust was proof of how long it had been lodged there. Perhaps someone had knocked it out by mistake when dusting the frame. Surely it couldn't have been deliberately placed there to catch his attention. The packet contained several pages of manuscript paper, the type students use to write their essays. As he looked through them, the dust smudged his fingers like the dark residue that comes off a moth's wings. There were some lines of writing. Poem to a Vampire by K. Hair Dishevelled. Absolute self-contradiction, dishevelled. Rusty abandoned car by the riverside in springtime. Such erotic ecstasy and blood. You grind your teeth instinctively on the gorgeous liquid. Night is enclosed, in each and every capsule, when swallowed as a tablet. A lyrical cockerel breaks into song. At the entrance to the Excelsior Hotel, the hotel's throat. A policeman with serious inflammation of the heart. Drags out a red carpet. Delicious, absolute revolutionary rules. To these rules the Vampire Party holds fast. These lines of unintelligible nonsense had been written out in quite awful handwriting. It was a poem one might describe as surrealistic, perhaps, but the propensity for obscurity, it revealed, was outmoded. Who on earth could have written it? The handwriting suggested a man, but surely no man of any sophistication. Hanyo yawned and went on to read the poem that followed, simply to pass the time. All of a sudden, the door opened. A thin, beautiful woman entered the room. Hanyo was astounded by what he saw. She looked about 30 and had a willowy body. Despite her beauty, however, she was clearly not at all well. She wore a brilliantly green kimono with an obi belt of the deepest blue. "What's that you are reading?" "Ah, that... I wonder, who do you think wrote the poems?" "I wouldn't know," Hanyo replied. He didn't really want to say. "It's the boy, Kaoru." "Oh, young Kaoru. I think you'll agree he's not particularly talented. I was reluctant to throw them away, that's why I kept them. But I have no interest in poetry and the like, so at some point I tucked them behind that picture there." "How did you find them?" "I saw them poking out from the edge of the frame." Hanyo hastily stuffed the bundle of papers back where he'd found it. "I am Kaoru's mother. It seems that Kaoru has recently benefited from your kindness. I am most sorry for all the inconvenience we have caused you." "It was no inconvenience. Please come nearer. Why not sit here by the fire? I'll get you another brandy." Hanyo did as she had suggested, settling into a lightly padded chair. His elbows rested comfortably on the armrests. The decorative brass studs in the fabric of the chair glittered in the light of the flames. He felt like a schoolteacher who had come for a chat at the home of the PTA chair. The woman sat herself opposite him, her own glass of brandy in hand. "Thank you for coming. I hope you can help." She raised her glass as she spoke. On her finger, a large diamond sparkled, engorged with reflected red light. Her facial features stood out clearly next to the fire, and the flickering flames lent them an air of agitation, only enhancing her beauty. "Excuse me for being so direct, but did Kaoru tell you something strange?" "Yes." "No. Well, what I mean is, how terrible. He's a smart boy, but he's such a dreamer. And in my opinion, they don't teach them anything useful these days." "You may be right there." "What do they teach them at school? That's not to say that education in the past was absolutely perfect. But I would prefer schools to provide more instruction about social responsibilities and manners, so that they knew the proper way to treat others. As things stand now, we pay out the school fees, but all the teachers seem to be doing is preparing their students to become political agitators and union members." "I couldn't agree with you more. And of course, these days everywhere gets bone dry with all the central heating. Tokyo is not especially cold, but you'd think we were living in the far north." "Yes, that's the way it is in those modern high-rise blocks. I much prefer this kind of traditional fireplace." "You say the nicest things." She laughed, her eyes smiling. Even the tiny creases around those eyes were beautiful, he thought. "Here at home, we try to rely on natural sources of heating as much as possible, and in summer we avoid air conditioning. I've heard that the method they use to heat high-rise buildings these days dries out the air so much that before you know it, you're bleeding from the throat. What a terrifying thought." "Ah, we're finally getting to the point." Hanyo's heart skipped a beat, but she returned straight away to more mundane matters. "People always harp on about how unhealthy life is in the city, and to a certain extent, they are right to do so. Civilization has gone too far, and we're suffering from terrible car pollution. On the other hand, the garbage men just never come. Garbage men these days are lazy good-for-nothings." "Exactly. I must say, you strike me as very sympathetic to all the problems a housewife has to deal with. Men these days are a funny lot. You know, it's quite surprising, but it's only the bachelors who seem to be aware of all the difficulties involved in looking after a house. The married men end up quite oblivious to everything. You are single, aren't you? I'm sure you are." "Yes." "From your youth, I imagine that you must be at the peak of your physical powers. May I call you Hanyo?" "Please do." "Thank you, Hanyo. Incidentally, what about all the fuss that's going on these days about Kusano Tsuyuko? That divorce that's in all the papers. The weekly magazines are just buzzing with it." "Well, she's a movie actress. What do you expect?" Hanyo meant, with the tone of this response, to indicate his lack of interest in such gossip. But she seemed not to catch on. "Oh yes, well, I always thought she had a dream marriage. Why does she suddenly want a divorce? The weekly has put it down to the husband's infidelity, of course, but surely that's not all there is to it. You have to remember that woman was born and bred in Kyoto, which of course means she keeps a tight grip on every penny her husband earns. I imagine she must have been very strict with his pocket money, and he obviously grew tired of being under her thumb. A wife should be as kind and generous to her husband as possible, in my opinion. Give him as much free rein as possible. What do you think, Hanyo? Are you aware of what's really going on?" "I have no idea," Hanyo replied brusquely. He was becoming bored and losing patience. Until that moment their chairs, separated by the fire, seemed quite a distance apart. It was only when her hand suddenly touched his on the armrest, as if swooping in from above, that he realized they were sitting just a few inches away from each other. Her hand had been right by the fire, but it was icy cold. "My apologies. My chatter bores you, I'm sure. Do you watch movies much?" "I do, but I only like Yakuza ones." "I see. Of course, cars are the latest thing for young people, aren't they? It's all the magazines seem to go on about these days. But reckless driving terrifies me. I can't imagine anything more senseless than dying in a car accident. Indeed. All I hope is that the governor of Tokyo will fix the traffic congestion in the city once and for all. I once encountered a person who had been seriously injured in a car accident on Highway 1, the one linking Tokyo and Yokohama. The ambulance didn't come for ages, and everyone got in such a state. And all the while blood was pouring out of the body. All they had to do was get him to a hospital quick and give him a blood transfusion. But then again, you have to be careful about purchased blood. It can give you hepatitis. That's true. Have you ever donated blood? Her eyes caught the reflection of flames from the fire. No, I can't say I have. Well, don't you think you might be neglecting your duty to society? Think of all the people in the world suffering from a shortage of blood. As a fully grown man, don't you feel you ought to be ready to lay down your life for someone who may be in need? Actually, all I want is to lay down my life. That's the very reason I came here tonight. Hanyo's feelings were so pent up that the words burst out of him. Of course, of course. She gazed at Hanyo's face, smiling faintly. He shuddered involuntarily in response. After a brief silence, the woman spoke again. I assume in that case that you will be staying the night. It was late, and the house was entirely quiet. Kaoru was doubtless already fast asleep. She led him up to the first floor, to a Japanese-style bedroom at the rear of the house. It was not the sick room he expected. The pervasive smell was of cold and mildew rather than of the woman who regularly slept there. I'll just light the heaters. One by one, she lit the portable heaters set up in 3 locations in the bedroom. The room immediately filled with the strong smell of kerosene fumes. The thought of these unstable heaters all falling over at once, like 3 collapsing towers of fire, passed through Hanyo's mind. A high bed consisting of 3 thick futon mattresses, one on top of each other, had been laid out on the floor. The woman was a little unsteady on her feet when, after undressing to her underwear, she got into bed. Hanyo gave her a hand. I've been so anemic recently that I often get dizzy fits. She spoke as if to cover her embarrassment. A high-quality but threadbare silk coverlet had been thrown on top of the bed. The mattresses seemed to have received very little airing at all, which bothered Hanyo. They should have been light, but their padding had become so dank that they felt unbelievably dense. As Hanyo gently removed her underwear, he was amazed at how youthful she looked. Was she really that boy's mother? She had the look of a woman of barely 30, but perhaps that was down to her skill with makeup. Her skin was white and smooth, tight and cold like porcelain. He could see no sign of wrinkles or of fading complexion, but the skin lacked the taut fullness of life. It had the pleasant fragrance of a candle, and yet it seemed completely unconnected to life itself. Something emanates from within the human form and lights up the whole body, but that vital element was missing in her. There was a lustrous quality for sure, but it was the luster of a corpse. The faint boniness of her arms betrayed her extreme thinness, and yet her breasts were full and firm, while her stomach was soft and white, like a vessel brimming with an abundance of rich milk. Hanyo had become extremely aroused and went to embrace her. But after submitting to his caresses for a while, almost in a daze, she twisted and turned her body like a serpent and squirmed out of his arms. Before he knew it, Hanyo found himself underneath. He ended up in that position without any sense of having been humiliated, however. She had very skillfully slipped out from under him and now lay on top, a move she had accomplished without the slightest injury to his male pride, as deftly as a snake might wriggle out on top of a strawberry leaf. Hanyo felt oddly dazed. He caught a faint whiff of alcohol and realized he was being given a swab. Was that a scalpel in her other hand? He intuitively closed his eyes and felt the icy scorch of alcohol on the skin of his upper arm. A pain shot through him. Arms first. My, what strong arms you have." She spoke in a whisper. The next instant, a different kind of pain arose as she closed her lips around the wound and sucked on it. There was a long moment of calm. He distinctly caught the gentle sound of the woman swallowing something. It was his blood, Hanyo realized, and a chill ran through him. "That was delicious. Thank you. That's enough for tonight." The woman's lips, smeared with blood, came toward him under the light from the floor lamp, in search of a kiss. Her cheeks were now glowing vividly as they had been earlier when she sat close to the flames. The color of abundant life. Her eyes overflowed with the same normal, healthy vitality you might see in any young woman walking down the street. Hanyo decided to settle into the house for the long term. Night after night, she sucked the blood out of him. One after another, various parts of his body came under her knife as she cut open his veins. The more she drank of it, the more she seemed to crave. One afternoon, he caught sight of her poring over a chart of the human body with her back to him. The chart had detailed drawings of all the veins and arteries in a human body marked out in red and blue. The sight sent a chill running through Hanyo, even though he had known from the start what he was letting himself in for by coming to this house. For her, he was no more than a body for her research, no different from one of those diagrams. But for the most part, he found life in the Inoue household to be extremely pleasant. In the morning, when the sparrows began to chirp and dawn light started to show in the windows, Hanyo would sense as he lay there drowsily that the woman was leaving the bed. He would slip back into sleep. She was going down to prepare breakfast for her son. There had been a complete turnaround in her health since he moved in. It was hard to credit she was the same person. An early riser. She would get up and almost immediately start humming to herself. Having seen her son off to school, she would return to bed, and at the sound of her footsteps, Hanyo would finally awaken. With each morning, her face appeared ever more radiant and healthy. Kaoru, too, was in much better spirits. Alone with Hanyo, he would chat away. "What an absolute bargain you were. You're the best thing I ever bought in my life. I don't even regret losing the Tsuguharu Fujita sketch, even if it was a memento of my dad. Mother has taken almost no time to recover. She began to improve from the first night you stayed over. She makes me proper breakfast in the mornings, and the whole house feels more cheerful. She and I are getting on a lot better too. I'm even feeling much happier in myself. It's all thanks to you, Hanyo. But there's still something that bothers me. Now that we've finally found someone so perfect for Mother and me, what'll happen when you die? I couldn't bear it if you did die, Hanyo, and I'm convinced Mother feels the same thing deep down. She's falling for you, which means she'll inevitably end up killing you before long. Until then, I beg you, don't desert Mother. Please let's go on living in this amazing way, the three of us together. I've always dreamt of being part of a happy family like this." Hanyo was surprised at how pleased and proud Kaoru's words made him feel. Whenever they all ate dinner or sat cosily together in front of the television, Hanyo would find himself succumbing to the illusion that this was indeed an ideal family. Kaoru was a very diligent student. Even while watching TV, he would have his English study book open on the table, and during commercials he would be leafing through its pages. As for his mother, she was hardly recognizable. She had so much energy. She threw herself wholeheartedly into her household duties, preparing delicious dinners in the evening, making sure to include liver, meat, and eggs for Hanyo to keep up his strength. She cleaned and polished the old house from top to bottom, and in the evenings she would do her knitting, her beautiful supple fingers clicking away with the needles as she watched TV. The smiles that graced her cheeks suggested she was divinely happy. Hanyo took up his old habit of poring over the newspapers, whose words had once seemed like lines of cockroaches to him. On occasion, they would go out together. But this was always as a couple, never individually. When they left the house, the woman bound Hanyo's right wrist to her left wrist with a delicate gold chain, which she would only remove when they got back to the house. The chain was so small that it escaped public attention, but she only needed to give it a slight tug for it to dig into his wrist and convey some message she was trying to send him. Hanyo began to find it too much effort to leave the house. The thing was, he truly enjoyed lounging around at home, basking in the family atmosphere. On the other hand, his body was becoming distinctly more sluggish with every day that passed. He was losing the will to get himself out. Whenever he felt lightheaded after making a sudden dash to cross a road, he realized that his time was running out. He didn't feel alarm at this exactly. It was more as if everything was becoming too much of a bother. And yet, it was so strange. He didn't feel any fear, nor for that matter any hankering for life. He grew progressively sleepier and more listless as the days grew warmer, and there was every sign that his condition would become even more pronounced as he entered the new season. One day they made a visit to Hanyo's old apartment. He thought he ought to pay the rent. The super came out of his office. "Where on earth have you been? Do you have any idea of how worried I was? Why disappear like that? But you look absolutely terrible. Are you sick?" "No." "What a shock you gave me. When you came in just now, you had the face of a corpse." The super, who liked the ladies, was distracted by the woman who was snuggling up to Hanyo. He clearly wanted to take Hanyo aside and ask him what the deal was, but the gold chain prevented Hanyo from giving a frank answer. "I just need to get into my apartment for a moment." "Be my guest. After all, the apartment's still yours." "I thought I would pay for the second half of the year in advance." Once the couple had entered the apartment, Hanyo took a look in the small drawer he had left locked. The 230,000 yen were still there. There was still such a thing as decency in this world, it seemed. The woman offered several times to pay his rent, but Hanyo refused. He handed over 120,000 yen to the concierge and got a receipt. He and the woman conversed in low tones. "You're too conscientious," she said. "No, I'm just handing things out to people to remember me by. After all, I have no relatives." Hanyo checked that the sold card was still up. Then he went back home with her, carrying a large stack of mail that had accumulated in his absence. He was glad to find himself with some reading material. But when he started to look through the mail, his eyes began to smart and flashes of white swirled across the pages. In recent days, Hanyo had been shocked by his pale and sickly appearance when he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. When shaving, for example. But he realized his anemia had got so bad that he could not even make out words on the page. "What's wrong?" "I have a little problem. My eyes are blurry, and I have difficulty reading." "You poor thing." Her voice, however, was quite cheerful. "Shall I read them for you?" "No, thank you." Needless to say, they were all quite inconsequential letters. One was from an old classmate, and there were several letters from people he did not know at all, such as this one. "I don't know who you are, sir, but I saw your Life for Sale ad and thought it must be a joke. I simply had to let you know what I thought of the matter, and that is why I am writing this letter. Are you not aware of the old saying, 'Our body is a gift from our parents. In gratitude, we keep that body safe'? I suppose you are not. Anyone who places such an ad in the newspaper must be quite without education. What on earth do you hope to attain by holding your life so cheaply? For an all too brief time before the war, we considered our lives worthy of sacrifice to the nation as honorable Japanese subjects. They called us common people the nation's treasure. I take it you are in the business of converting your life into filthy lucre only because, in the world we inhabit, money reigns supreme. Personally, I resent this world where money drives everything, but it is precisely because of human trash like you that financiers can lord it over us. Let me be blunt. Your ad is abhorrent. It represents the very worst of moral turpitude. The letter continued in this vein for at least another 8 pages. Hanyo could just imagine some pushy, ruddy-faced, middle-aged man, out of a job and with lots of time on his hands. With some effort, Hanyo managed to tear up the letter and toss it aside. His fingers had very little strength left in them. Another letter, this one from a woman and littered with misspellings. "You're quite cool, aren't you? Really cool. You come straight out and say life for sale." Life for sale. So I guess that means you have the rest of your life worked out. I'm selling my life too, so why don't we trade, and go beddy-buys as if we're already intimate? Next morning we can discover life together. We'll grab the joy of human life. Let me blow your whistle while we run among the blossoming rosebuds. Would you like to marry me? A few of the other letters contained similar requests. Once he'd read them all. Hanyo was so exhausted that he had to ask the woman to tear them up for him. Unlike his own fingers, hers were graceful and strong, and they flushed at the tips as she ripped the thick bundle of letters effortlessly into tiny pieces. In bed that evening, unusually serious, she put her mouth to his ear. "I'll have Kaoru stay over at a relative's house tomorrow." "Why?" "Because I want the two of us to be free to enjoy ourselves to our heart's content." "But don't we do that every night anyway?" "Tomorrow evening will be special." She laughed. He caught the scent of blood as her warm breath brushed his nose. "Tomorrow evening, I really want to make sure Kaoru is not involved in any way." "But will he be willing to stay somewhere else?" "Oh yes, the boy's not a fool. So, what's the plan?" She paused for a moment. Her hair, which had grown even more lustrous lately, gave the illusion of swelling in the dim lamplight. "This may sound terrible, but I'm a little bored with the blood from your veins. It tastes insipid and doesn't hit the spot for me anymore. Tomorrow evening, I've decided, it'll finally be time to move on to your arteries." "So this is it then?" "Yes. I've been wondering for a while which of your arteries to go for. The carotid arteries give the best result, I believe. I've always thought you had a lovely thick neck. I wanted to sink my teeth in as soon as I laid eyes on you. But so far, I've always managed to restrain myself. Please, it's all yours." "Thank you. How happy you make me feel. You're so sweet. You know, I believe you are the first real man I've ever met. That's why I've decided—" "Decided what?" "After feasting on your blood tomorrow night, I'm going to knock over the kerosene heaters and set the house on fire." "And what will happen to you?" "Silly. I'll just go up in flames." Hanyo closed his eyes. He had never before experienced anything like this in his life. A true meeting of hearts. His eyelids twitched. He was not used to this. Before he knew it, it was the next evening. "Shall we go out for a walk, our very last on this earth together?" said the woman. That day, they were both going to meet their deaths. For winter, it was a beautifully warm evening. Kaoru had already been sent off to a relative straight from school. "There's a small park in the neighborhood," she continued. "It takes its name from the Musashi Plain, and the elm trees look beautiful with their bare boughs. I would love to look at them one final time. Couldn't I just stay at home? But I want us to take a walk and share one final memory together, like a couple of young lovers." "All right, but no longer than 30 minutes, please." The truth was, Hanyo now found it really irksome to go out for any sort of walk. He just about had the physical strength to stand, provided he had a pillar or something to lean on, but even then he was so weak he became lightheaded. A stroll in the park was the last thing he wanted. He felt unbearably sluggish, and having his arteries cut open was preferable to continuing in this state of semi-wakefulness. "And I'd rather people didn't see how pale and wasted I am." "Nonsense. You really have the ideal, perfect look. I don't know why, but men can never understand how attractive that is. It's so romantic. Truly. It's just how I imagine Chopin to have been. Enough of that. I don't have TB. While they joked and chatted, she changed into her leather walking gear and then approached him, gold chain in hand. Hanyo had chosen to wear a loud apricot-coloured sweater, which he hoped would give his complexion a little more colour. He left the house with the slender gold chain around his wrist, like a dog being led out for its walk. Once outside, he felt much better. Invigorated by the air, he inhaled every breath so deeply that it made his body sway. The thought that this was the last time he would ever view an evening landscape made it all the more precious. Was there ever a time when I really loved life? He wondered. The fact that he even had to ask such a question indicated his total lack of self-confidence. Right now, he could feel a love of life growing within himself, but that might be put down to his lightheadedness and poor physical condition. The beauty of the evening sky pierced him. He felt his heart thumping erratically, and his temples throbbed. Soon, a cluster of giant elm trees loomed into view, their wintry branches, like beautiful lace, stretching over the roofs of this residential district. "You see that? Those are the elms I was referring to earlier," the woman said. "The park is famous for them." So he was finally to die tonight. Hanyo was looking forward to it. What particularly pleased him was that it was not going to happen by his own hand. Suicide was actually harder than people think, too dramatic for his taste. And if you were going to get yourself killed, it would have to be for some reason. No one had ever detested him or resented him that much, and anyway, the thought that he might be of sufficient interest to others that they would want him dead horrified him. Selling your life was such a splendid way out. It took away all need for responsibility. The tops of those beautiful elms captured the pale shades of the Eveningsky in such an exquisite way. A net spread across the heavens. That's what it looked like. But what did it all mean? Why was nature so beautiful for no reason at all? And why did people worry themselves about such trifling matters? But that was all in the past now. The thought that his own life was about to cease cleansed his heart, the way peppermint cleanses the mouth. They passed a tobacconist's kiosk at the park entrance. In front of it was a red mailbox. An old lady sat tending the kiosk. That was as much as Hanyo remembered. The next moment, a white tornado whirled up the back of his head. He grew dizzy and almost collapsed. He thought he could feel someone trying to hold him up with their hands, but then everything went blank. When he came to, he was in a hospital bed. It was already night, and a plump nurse was reading a magazine spread open under a shaded lamp. "What the hell happened to me?" Hanyo asked. Despite an intense ringing in his ears, he could make out the nurse's words. "Ah, so you've come round. Please relax. There is nothing to worry about." "What on earth happened? I know I collapsed by the tobacconists." "It was a serious case of insufficient blood flow to the brain. You fainted. The woman at the tobacconist's must have called an ambulance. It was an ambulance that brought you here. They said it was an emergency." "Another ambulance?" Hanyo's heart sank. And then, well? Well, what? What was the diagnosis? Serious lack of red blood cells. The doctor was amazed. When he took a blood sample, yours was quite yellow and seemed to consist mostly of water. He was surprised you could even go for a walk in the state you were in. Based on all the indications, he concluded, you must be one of those people who make a living donating blood, but you'd taken things way too far this time. Yet you didn't look the type. And then, of course, you were accompanied by your beautiful wife. Oh, where did that woman go? What are you saying? You mean she wasn't your wife? Where is she? She went home. I'm sure she felt you were in good hands once she heard from the doctor what was wrong with you. You'll get back to normal provided you stay in the hospital for about a month, fortify your blood with the right medication, and take nutrients. She said she had something to do at home. That was about 3 hours ago. Have I been unconscious all this time? No, That would have been a cause for real concern. The doctor mixed a sedative in with your serum and nutrient injections. After all, the most important thing is rest, complete rest, no activity or excitement. But I must say, she seemed a very caring woman, and so gorgeous and healthy looking too. It was just like she'd sucked all the energy out of you. Hanio was lost for words. Before she left, she made an advance payment for 1 month's stay in the hospital, by banker's cheque. She was most kind. She even gave me a generous tip. That's how I know you're not a professional blood donor. Hanio remained silent, his eyes shut. Then a sudden thought hit him, and he leapt up with a cry. "What's the matter? Please, no sudden movements." "I've just thought of something dreadful. It's an emergency. Call her. Now. Please." Hanio gave the nurse the Inoue family telephone number. After insisting once more that he lie down, she dialed the telephone at his bedside. Hanio waited uneasily. His heart began to pound again. There's no one there. "Is it ringing?" "Yes." The moment the nurse put down the receiver, he heard the wail of a fire engine siren start up in the distance. "Oh dear, there must be a fire somewhere. There hasn't been a drop of rain round here for ages, so it doesn't take much for a fire to break out." Hanio listened in silence as the siren came closer. Another siren started up somewhere else, and the two sounds became entwined. Hanio could not contain himself. "Where are we now?" "Eh?" "What's the location of this hospital?" "Ojikubo. The hospital was built on the highest part of town and is well known for the splendid vistas it offers of the area. Even long-term patients don't complain because they get such great views. It's more like a hotel, if you ask me, and this room is one of the best. Can you see the district where she lives from here?" "I think so. It should be just beyond the park." "Yes, of course. Please stick your head out of the window and tell me if that's where the fire is." The two wailing sirens grew louder. After insisting one more time that he should not overexcite himself, the nurse went to the window. She opened it slightly and took a look. "Oh, I can see it," she cried. "The fire is definitely coming from that district." Beyond the crook of her arm, Hanio saw a sky so red it made her white uniform grow crimson. Wildly, he tried to get out of the bed, but dizziness overwhelmed him and he lost consciousness. Despite repeated inquiries, he found it impossible to learn about the fire in any more detail. A plainclothes police officer, a detective by the look of him, visited and subjected him to a brief interrogation in the doctor's presence. Hanio was going to have to come clean about his relationship. "So what was your relation to the deceased?" the detective asked, his foul-smelling breath reaching as far as the bed. "I was a friend." "While out walking with her, you fainted and were brought here, correct?" "That's right, but you've got to tell me, what on earth has this—" Before the doctor could signal him to stop, the detective began to fill Hanio in with the dry facts of the situation. Mrs. Inoue was burned to death in a fire that started in her house last night. She had a reputation for loose morals, and whenever there is a fire with a single fatality, questions are always raised. Her only son is with relatives at the moment, but it was pitiful the way he clung to his mother's corpse and wept. Apparently his school grades are really outstanding. Anyway, you have a perfect alibi and you're under no suspicion yourself. I'd simply like you to answer a few questions." Hanio was surprised to find himself, who had never lamented anyone's death, weeping as he listened. Where did these tears come from? "All I can say is, I loved her." Hanio spoke with feeling. "We're not questioning what she might have left you in her will, or anything like that. Please, don't be so vulgar." The doctor whispered something to the detective. "Right. Well, look after yourself." With these parting words, the detective left to go back to the police station. The elderly doctor addressed Hanio in a soft voice, looking down at him in his bed. It's all got rather complicated, but the most important thing for you is to stay absolutely calm and recuperate. Your hospital fees have been paid in advance, with some to spare. And I believe the lady's final wish was for you to rest so you could return to your former good health as soon as possible. You're young, and you'll get through it all without this unfortunate incident doing lasting damage. Even medication depends on your frame of mind. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, right? What better way to remember her than by starting out on a new life in a positive frame of mind? Right, now it's time I gave you your sedative. Hanyo felt well disposed toward this man who reminded him as much as anything of a wizened old stag. He seemed more like a pastor than a doctor. Hanyo recalled similar commonsensical words of encouragement being given him on a previous occasion. The details were different, but someone had used almost identical phrases when he left accident and emergency after he had taken his overdose. Those words had encouraged him to throw himself headlong into daily activity and live life to the full. Of course, whether or not he was willing to take such advice was a different matter. Despite his worries, Hanyo was young enough for his recovery to be relatively speedy. It became clear that he wasn't going to have to stay a whole month in hospital after all. He could probably leave in 2 weeks, the doctor told him. One day, Kaoru dropped in. Hanyo felt rather reluctant to look him in the eye, so afraid was he of the kind of recriminations he might receive. But Kaoru seemed quite happy. He spoke very freely, despite the nurse's presence. "Hanyo, I came because I wanted you to know how grateful I feel for what you did. I know all sorts of investigations are being carried out into Mother's death." Did she kill herself? Was it arson? Did the fire start accidentally? But whatever the outcome, Mother is dead. There is nothing we can do about it. When I think about it now, I believe she just couldn't stomach life. And I've come to the opinion that we should simply treasure those happy memories when the three of us were living together. At least with you alive, Hanyo, we can share those memories from time to time. And above all, thanks to you, I believe that Mother went to her death having tasted true happiness for the first time. I've so much to thank you for. While the young man delivered these words, which would normally be expected to come from the mouth of an adult, large tears fell from his eyes onto the knees of his school trousers. "Come and visit whenever you want," said Hanyo. "Feel free to speak to me about anything." "Oh, thank you." "Ah, there's a small favor I'd like to ask of you. Fortunately, I still have the key to my apartment in my possession. I had it on a key ring which I kept in my trouser pocket, so it wasn't destroyed in the fire. Sorry to trouble you, but if I gave you the key, would you be willing to go and check my apartment?" "Oh, so you're going to start all that again?" The boy took a step back. "Please don't. How could you? Haven't you learned your lesson yet?" "Don't worry, just go and take a look. I imagine there's a whole stack of mail behind the door. All you have to do is pick it up for me." The boy agreed and took his leave. Immediately, the nurse started pumping Hanyo for information. "So, what kind of work do you do?" "I don't think that's any of your business." "I'm just curious to know." "I'm a male escort, but I guess you could tell." "Really? I expect you're far too expensive for me. I offer a free service to young ladies." "Goodness." The nurse rolled up the hem of her white skirt to reveal white garters around the tops of her white stockings, and above that her fleshy thighs, which were tinged with the tan colouring of countryside clay. "Wow, is that what they meant when they said you get a good view in this hospital?" "Maybe. So, are you getting your strength back?" By way of reply, Hanyo took the nurse by her arms and pulled her onto the bed. It was some time before Kaoru came back. Hanyo had been getting worried, but just after dinner the boy turned up. "That was terrifying," he said, throwing the mail onto the bed. "What was? The nurse has already gone home today, and no one else is coming, so you can relax. Tell me what happened." The boy was out of breath. I opened the door and was rummaging around when two guys burst in. Japanese guys? Yes, but what's that got to do with it? I just had a feeling they might be foreigners. And then one of them grabbed me from behind and asked if I was the one who put the ad in the newspaper. I almost stopped breathing. The other said I was just a kid, so it couldn't be me. Then the first man complained how they'd been coming day after day, and just when they finally thought they'd caught their guy, they end up with a child. At that point, the other man suggested that I was probably running an errand for you, and it might be a good idea to force me to reveal your whereabouts. He had a scary voice. I pretended I'd tell them everything they wanted, but instead I grabbed the mail and fled back here. The boy suddenly stopped speaking, and his mouth opened wide in terror. The door of the room had slowly swung open, without warning. Two men rushed in. "Who are you?" Hanyo spoke calmly. To describe him as calm implies something of the heroic. But in fact, he was perfectly at ease with the possibility that these men might dispense with him at the drop of a hat. In his heart, he still harboured a wistful desire to follow in the traces of that beautiful vampire, a desire that threw into question his earlier frivolous yet pragmatic attitude toward death. But what did any of this matter? Who cares about the motives of someone about to die? One of the men stood just inside the door, with his back to it, keeping guard over the room, while the other kept his eyes fixed on Hanyo as he lay in the bed. Young Kaoru cowered against the wall on the other side of the bed, so that Hanyo appeared to be shielding the boy with his own body. The men appeared to be both in their 30s, one slightly older than the other. Their actions were not quite flamboyant enough to mark them out as Yakuza. The steeliness in their expressions and their rugged features suggested they probably started off in the military or as police officers. Well, they're certainly nimble on their feet, Hanyo thought, but their dress sense leaves something to be desired. He was even tempted to advise one of them that a tired mouse-grey tie never works with an ash-grey suit. Right, let's get started. The elder of the two men, who seemed to be in charge, did not take his eyes off Hanyo as he spoke to his companion. This second man, who had been by the door, approached the bed. As he did so, Hanyo noticed that the first man was holding a black gun in his hands and the muzzle was pointed straight at him. "Don't move, and keep your trap shut. Got it? And if the kid squeaks or tries to escape, he'll get a taste of this." Rather predictable script, Hanyo thought. But then, to his surprise, the man who had approached him now perched himself on the edge of the bed. He grabbed Hanyo's left arm by the wrist and began carefully to measure his pulse. 30 seconds of silence passed. "Well," said the first man. 38 in 30 seconds, replied his companion. "That makes a rate of 76. That's not very high. It's completely normal, isn't it? A normal pulse is a little bit lower. With some people, it's even around 50. Right then." The first man pushed the cold muzzle of the gun up against Hanyo's pajamas, just where his heart was. "Listen to me. In 3 minutes, I'm going to pull the trigger. If you move or make a noise before then, I'll shoot straight away. Otherwise, you'll at least have 3 minutes to live." Kaoru began to whimper. "Stop that!" the man growled under his breath. Kaoru fell into a heap on the floor, weeping soundlessly. The first man indicated with a glance that his companion should take Hanyo's pulse again. Silence, like a black river flowing by. "What is it now?" "That's odd. It's gone down. 68. "Impossible. Take it again." "Okay."